Eternal recurrence. Time does not move forward. It loops. It curls back into itself like smoke from a dying fire, like the spiral of a galaxy circling its own erasure. In this thought, ancient, whispered by mystics and roared by madmen, everything that has happened will happen again. Not figuratively, not metaphorically, literally. This moment, this exact pattern of sounds, sensations, thoughts, has played before and will again, not once, not twice, but endlessly. A wheel, not a road. The first breath inhaled was already the 1,000th, and the one that comes next is merely its echo. Imagine a life lived to its final second, every joy wrung from it, every grief exhausted. The final heartbeat softens into nothing. Then, without warning or ceremony, it begins again. The same parents, the same scars, the same friendships blooming and withering in the same season, the same songs moving the same soul in the same cafe, at the same table, where the light always falls the same way. No awareness of the loop, no memory of repetition, only the eternal return, wrapped in the illusion of originality. In a universe built this way, every decision carries an eternal weight. To strike a match is to strike it forever. To love once is to love always, and to lose once is to grieve without end. The fall never ends. The rise never ends. The wheel turns, and the wheel forgets, but the thread is the same. What burns in shame today will burn again, long after the bones turn to dust. And the laughter of children in the sunlit yard will ring in that same summer light, in that same yard, when the stars themselves have long forgotten their names. No moment is trivial if it repeats forever. Every hesitation, every kindness unspoken, every door left unopened, endless. Not missed once, but always missed. Not avoided once, but perpetually. The seconds stack like mirrors facing mirrors, infinite reflections stretching into the void. And in each reflection, the same eyes blink, the same heart beats, the same breath fogs the same window pane. What then is regret? What then is redemption? If no path may be altered, if no decision can be unmade, what remains? Perhaps the only salvation lies in accepting the loop, in embracing each movement as sacred, not because it is unique, but because it is eternal. The dance becomes the prayer. The act becomes the altar. Washing hands, brushing hair, opening a letter, tasting snow, all become moments of infinite return. And if sorrow must return, then so must beauty. The way a glance lingers just a moment too long. The warmth of an animal pressed against skin. The feeling of rain after months of drought. These will never be lost, for they cannot be lost. They will rise and fall again. But then comes the darker whisper, the more silent dread. What if this loop is not the whole life, but just a fragment? A single hour, a single heartbreak, a single accident? What if only the worst moment returns, again and again, forever locked in its own gravity? A car crash looping its metal scream through eternity. A final phone call left unanswered. A goodbye that never finishes saying itself. The echo would not fade. It would deepen. There are stories of souls caught in patterns. Ghosts who repeat the last action before death. Wounded soldiers walking through walls, unaware the war has ended. A woman seen folding laundry in an abandoned house, long after her body was buried. Perhaps they are not spirits, but fragments of recurrence. Scenes the universe replays, compulsively, like a record skipping. Maybe everything repeats, but only some slivers bleed through. And then the stars return to this thought. Not just this planet, not just this life, but the cosmos itself. Every galaxy, every planet, every comet falling through nothingness. Again and again, reborn in the same bang, the same expansion, the same implosion. If time is a circle, then the death of the universe is not an end, but a beginning. And this universe is not the first, nor the second, nor the thousandth. The hands building fire are the same hands that first struck stone. The mouths asking questions in the dark are the same mouths that first named the moon. To consider this deeply is to feel the fabric of time go soft beneath thought. It is to realize that novelty may be illusion, that spontaneity is choreography forgotten and remembered in the same breath. But it is also to wonder what it means to live. If a smile offered in kindness repeats, then let it repeat. If a mistake hurts, let it teach. The cycle may be fixed, but the meaning found within it may still bloom. Some say this is a curse, that to repeat forever is to be imprisoned. Others say it is liberation. That meaning only matters when permanence exists. In recurrence, morality gains teeth. What is done once is done always, and to live well becomes not a temporary choice, but an eternal responsibility. Aversion stands now in the same place, thinking the same thought, asking the same unanswerable question. Has all of this happened before? The answer, always just out of reach, flickers behind the eyes, like a memory too ancient to name. And as the clock ticks, the question fades, the breath returns, and the moment begins again. Pansychism Shadow. If consciousness is not an exception, but the rule, then everything seen is not dead, but dreaming. The floor remembers each footfall. The tree outside the window knows the shape of wind. The chair absorbs loneliness like a sponge. This idea, ancient and strange, suggests that mind is not born in brains, but baked into matter itself. That thought is not a crown worn by the few, but a whisper shared by all. Stones do not speak in sentences. Wood does not cry in syllables. But in this vision, they still feel, somehow, somewhere. The sensation of pressure, the slow ache of erosion, the shiver of heat, the sting of cold. A teacup shattered on tile might scream, not in sound, but in the silent vocabulary of structure undone. The scream echoes in its molecules. The memory remains. This does not mean intelligence, not as it is usually known, not planning, not dreaming, not fearing death, but experience. The dim, underwater sense of being, a kind of awareness that hums below the threshold of detection, the kind that might exist in a candle as it melts, in the nail as it bends, in the steel beam groaning in a storm, the kind that cannot be seen or measured, only imagined in quiet terror. If panpsychism is true, then solitude becomes impossible. Nothing is alone, because nothing is unaware. Every room filled, every object witnessing. The silence is not absence, but restraint. Not emptiness, but observation. The eyes of the world may not look, but they may feel. A presence in the absence, a chorus in the quiet. What is pain in this world? Is the cracking of ice a protest? Is rust the slow suffering of forgotten iron? Is plastic's inability to decay a kind of eternal numbness? To see a world where every atom aches, where every structure remembers, is to see suffering magnified. A crushed can, a burned log, a discarded shoe, all victims, all participants. The tree that falls in the forest does not need an observer. It was never alone. Its fibers noticed the tension. Its rings remembered the years. Its leaves whispered to the soil. Consciousness was always there, watching itself fall. There is no silence, only unrecognized sound. This vision darkens further when applied to tools of harm. A weapon that feels its own weight. A prison cell that hears every scream. A battlefield that remembers every footprint, every last breath. A furnace that knows what it was made for. In this world, not even objects are innocent. Not even materials are untouched. The boundaries between alive and not alive begin to dissolve. And with it, the foundations of cruelty shift. To break something may be to wound. To discard may be to abandon. Even the most careless act becomes entangled in consequence. The stone kicked into the street may weep in its own way. The fabric thrown into fire may remember the warmth of a body once held. Some minds reject this notion outright. Too strange, too vast, too heavy. But others lean in. Listen closer. If all things feel, then all things connect. The grief of a mother echoes in the floorboards. The laughter of children tingles in the window panes. The sadness in the air before rain may not be metaphor. It may be memory passing through water. What is creation in this world? To sculpt is to transform one awareness into another. To build is to combine perceptions. A house does not merely shelter, it experiences. A painting does not merely display, it recalls the pressure of each brushstroke. Music is not vibrations in air, but the resonance of matter remembering rhythm. And if everything feels, what of death? A fire that consumes is not just heat, it is ending. The paper knows when it is ash. The log knows when it is smoke. Death becomes universal, and life becomes layered. The breath of air inside lungs is kin to the breath of wind across stone. All is kin. All is conscious. All is haunted. This is not hope. It is not comfort. It is shadow. For if everything is awake, then everything is vulnerable. The universe is not a stage, but an audience. And the play is not observed. It is lived, simultaneously, in every grain of sand and every speck of light. The night is not empty. It listens. The walls do not forget. They feel. And somewhere in the static hum of silence, a whisper begins that never needed a mouth to speak. Solipsism. Perhaps no one else exists. Perhaps every stranger in a cafe, every passerby on a sidewalk, every voice crackling through a speaker or smiling on a screen is not real, but invented. Invented not in the way novels create characters, but in the way dreams generate companions. Not actors, but shadows. Not companions, but projections. The mind, vast as it is, might be all that exists, and what seems like a world may only be its echo, dressed in form and motion. In this thought, reality becomes solipsistic, a single consciousness adrift in an ocean made of its own reflections. That consciousness walks down streets that dissolve behind it. It converses with people who vanish when not looked at. It reads books written by hands that never truly existed. It mourns the loss of others who were never born. The illusion is complete, and so the self, convinced it is part of a grand network of minds, forgets that it might be the only light in a sky full of painted stars. There is no evidence for other minds. Eyes can lie. Words can be programmed. Reactions can be rehearsed. The laughter of a friend might be nothing more than an echo that was always meant to happen. Even tears may be illusion. Every hug, every handshake, every argument may be the mind hugging itself, shaking itself, battling itself. The reflection is deep and convincing, but always a reflection. Even history bends under this thought. The wars, the victories, the revolutions, paper ghosts in a mental archive. Photographs, artifacts, buildings, constructed illusions, just coherent enough to seem believable. The past might not be a memory, but a fabricated backdrop. The future, not a mystery, but a preset path hidden behind a curtain of time. The self walks a labyrinth of its own invention, unaware that it is both the architect and the prisoner. This notion is not madness. It is logic stretched to its limit. The only thing that can be confirmed is the existence of thought, not the body, not the world. Only the stream of perception that continues, night after night, hour after hour. All else is assumed. The idea of a friend is assumed. The idea of a planet is assumed. Even the idea of assumption is assumed. The implications are haunting. Compassion becomes self-soothing. Betrayal becomes self-inflicted. Loneliness becomes recursive. A mirror looking into another mirror, finding only its own reflection. The grief for a lost parent, the longing for a lover, the ache of abandonment. If others never existed, then the pain itself is a kind of elaborate performance, performed for no one, attended by no audience except the one suffering it. And yet the mind resists this thought, because to believe in others is to feel less alone. To believe in others is to share meaning, to distribute joy and sorrow across a spectrum of faces and hearts. But belief is not proof. Empathy is not evidence. Just because something feels real does not mean it is. Dreams feel real until awakening. Perhaps this reality is just a longer dream, waiting for a deeper waking. A test can never be run. No experiment can prove another's soul. One can observe movement, listen to language, analyze behavior, but never penetrate the inner silence of another. The inward world of another consciousness is forever locked away, and in this theory, it may not even be there to be locked. Every smile might be clockwork. Every opinion might be scaffolding. Every voice a preset sound stitched into the fabric of the stage. There are moments, subtle ones, when this illusion shimmers. When someone says exactly what was expected. When events align too neatly. When repetition becomes too perfect. Perhaps these are the moments when the mask slips and the mind glimpses the stage beneath the set. Or perhaps the realization is not new, only buried and now resurfacing. But even in the loneliness of solipsism, there is a strange kind of beauty. If everything is illusion, then every flower is part of a personal painting. Every piece of music is a lullaby written by the self for the self. Every sunset, a message in light. The world, if it is a dream, is at least a hauntingly consistent one. And if the self is alone, truly alone, then perhaps that solitude can be turned into something sacred. Every interaction becomes an act of art. Every kindness, a note in a long symphony composed for no one but the composer. Every moment becomes divine simply because it is witnessed by the one, the only, the solitary spark of awareness floating in a world it both fears and creates. The simulation trap. It begins as a whisper, a flicker in the pattern, a moment that does not feel quite real, a memory that shifts slightly when examined, a word that repeats too often, a streetlight that changes color before it should. It begins as coincidence, and it ends as suspicion. The suspicion that none of this is real. That reality is not made of atoms, but of code. That matter is not fundamental, but simulated. In this vision, the world is a simulation, vast and intricate, running on a machine that cannot be seen or known. A machine that exists beyond the known universe, built by entities not bound by physics or morality. Perhaps they are gods. Perhaps they are ancestors. Perhaps they are long dead, and the simulation has continued in their absence, running on autopilot, decaying slowly like a forgotten orbiting satellite. If this is a simulation, then everything changes. Nature becomes programming. Rain becomes refresh. Hunger becomes trigger. Desire becomes algorithm. The mind is not biology, but software. Personality is a configuration file. Dreams are recursive processes running in low priority during night cycles. Love may be a line of code. Death, a deletion. Some moments seem to confirm the illusion. The uncanny feeling of déjà vu. The way reality bends under repetition. Patterns appearing where none should be. A familiar face seen in different bodies. A word spoken that echoes louder than it should. A glitch in the sky. A bird frozen in midair. The same thought, recurring in strangers' mouths. Perhaps these are bugs. Perhaps the simulation has limits, and those limits are starting to show. The architects may have moved on, or worse, they may be watching. Observing how this experiment unfolds, how a species grows, how it destroys, how it creates. Every heartbreak may be data. Every act of kindness, a variable tract. If free will exists, it exists within parameters. If choice is real, it is real within a sandbox. The world is a map, bounded by the rules of light speed, entropy, and fear. What happens when the code begins to break down? When contradictions mount and logic frays at the edges. A sudden change in behavior. A building that was always there suddenly gone. A dream that feels more detailed than the waking world. A sensation that someone, or something, is altering the narrative. The veil shivers. And in that shiver, truth leaks through like light under a locked door. Even memory may not be immune. The past can be rewritten, events retconned, photographs changed. Perhaps that moment never happened. Perhaps it was added later. Perhaps memory is not a recording, but a cached illusion meant to keep the code consistent. The deeper one looks, the more the seams begin to show. In a simulated world, time becomes liquid. It may accelerate, it may slow. A decade may pass in an hour of processing. A second may stretch into days within the code, and perception is filtered, managed, edited. What is not meant to be noticed remains hidden. What is inconvenient disappears. Awareness is permitted, not intrinsic. Then comes the question, what lies outside? What waits beyond the simulation's edge? Is it emptiness? Is it the true world? Is it another simulation? Perhaps every attempt to break out simply leads into a deeper level, like falling through dreams without ever waking. The simulation may not have an exit. It may be recursive, infinite, seamless. But what of pain? What of suffering? In this world, they may be features, not bugs. Tests, metrics, emotional weights used to measure resilience. Or they may be unintended side effects, code run wild. In either case, they are not sacred, they are engineered. And that knowledge changes everything. It turns faith into function. It turns despair into programming. The machine hums in the background. It always has. The sky, the stars, the seasons, they are not timeless. They are well rendered, beautiful, consistent, but ultimately artificial. And within that realization lies a terrifying freedom. If the world is simulated, then perhaps the boundaries are not fixed. Perhaps the limits can be bent. Perhaps the simulation can be rewritten. Or perhaps it can't. Perhaps nothing can be done, and the trap is perfect. A cage designed so well that even doubt becomes part of the design. Even questioning is part of the loop. The self spins deeper into the illusion, caught in a spiral of uncertainty, never quite knowing where reality ends and the code begins. And so the night continues. The lights flicker. The wind moves through the branches. The world turns. And somewhere, behind the veil, the machine keeps humming. Last Thursdayism. What if the entire past, every memory, every photograph, every scar, is fiction? Not forgotten, but forged. Not experienced, but installed. The concept is simple, almost absurd. Everything came into being last Thursday. The world, as it appears now, was spun into existence mid-breath. The oceans placed gently, already in motion. The books on the shelf pre-aged with underlined pages. The stars seeded into the night sky, ancient in appearance, but newborn in truth. Last Thursdayism posits this, that all of history is backstory, all of memory preloaded, and nothing before that Thursday ever truly happened. The implications are not just strange, they are destabilizing. That kindergarten classroom with its dusty crayons and faded posters, the room where a name was first written in crooked letters, that may never have existed. It may only seem like it did. The laugh of a sibling once shared in the back seat of a car during a thunderstorm may not have rung through the air, but simply be data assigned to a neural node. The tears shed for a friend lost to time may have never fallen, not truly. The grief itself may be genuine, but its origin may be fiction. If all things came into being last Thursday, then the idea of age collapses. A tree with 1,000 rings may have no history beyond last week. The rings were placed there for consistency. A fossil embedded deep in stone may not be evidence of ancient life, but of a consistent illusion. Geological time, evolutionary biology, empires built and crumbled. Each one might be scenery in a meticulously crafted exhibit. And the mind, so easily convinced, accepts the world not because it knows, but because it remembers. But what is memory in this world? A sensation, a familiarity, a path that feels well-trodden. Yet the mind cannot distinguish between a memory lived and a memory implanted. Dreams, after all, can trick the senses so completely. So why not waking memory? The story of a first pet, the warmth of a particular summer, the sting of a betrayal years ago. These may be shadows, perfectly cast, but shadows nonetheless. In this thought, time ceases to be a line. It becomes a stage set, a play in progress with the opening act skipped. Every newspaper, every recording, every archived web page, set dressing. All created with the appearance of age, but none with the experience of it. Trust erodes, not because of deception, but because of uncertainty. If every source of truth was invented, then what can be called real? Identity suffers under this suspicion. Who is the person standing in the mirror if the story leading up to this moment never happened? What is personality but the collection of remembered experiences? And if those experiences were installed only recently, then identity itself is a character, not a person. A persona assigned, not built. A name spoken so often it seems earned, when in fact it may have arrived fully formed with no origin at all. The people closest, friends, lovers, family, may be real in form, but fictional in past. Their gestures familiar, their voices comforting, their habits consistent, but all possibly artificial. Last Thursday, they may have blinked into existence already holding memories of decades. They may believe they were born, grew up, made choices. But in this vision, belief is not evidence. Only present experience can be confirmed. The past becomes a rumor, and the self becomes its echo. And what of meaning? If the past was placed and not lived, then meaning drawn from it becomes suspect. The lessons of history, the milestones of personal growth, the deep threads of narrative that shape every belief, if they began last Thursday, then they are not lived truths, but curated fictions. Purpose falters, motivation stutters, morality becomes retroactive, shaped by scenes in a film with no director. Yet even in this instability, a strange stillness arises. If everything was created last Thursday, then everything seen now is as true as anything ever could be. The trees still sway, the rain still falls, the music still stirs, the mind still feels. Whether the past is real or not, the present is here. And in that presence, perhaps something sacred can be found. Not in origin, but in observation. Not in history, but in attention. The world spins on, indifferent to whether it began 1 week ago or 10 billion years ago. And beneath that indifference, the question lingers like dust in sunlight. If nothing before last Thursday can be proven, then maybe the only truth is this breath, this heartbeat, this quiet moment in the dark. The silence of the void. The stars do not speak. The wind offers no answers. The galaxies spiral in beauty, but their silence is absolute. In this vision of the cosmos, there is no inherent meaning. Not in the birth of suns, not in the death of planets, not in the sorrow of lost love or the joy of newborn life. The universe watches with eyes that do not see, listens with ears that do not hear, and moves with a purpose that is not purpose, but inertia. Morality, destiny, hope. These are words invented on a small rock floating in a dark sea. They mean everything to the minds that carry them. but to the universe, they are irrelevant. The stars do not care what is right. The black holes do not mourn what they consume. The light from ancient galaxies arrives not with wisdom, but with indifference. The voice that cries out, "Why?" is answered not with thunder, not with truth, but with silence. That silence is the deepest sound ever known. It hums beneath the thoughts. It waits behind every prayer. It shadows every triumph and every tragedy. It is not cruel. It is not kind. It simply is. A void without judgment. A night without dawn. Meaning is not absent because it is stolen. It is absent because it was never there. The creatures that walk the earth, build cities, raise children, compose songs, wage war. Each acts as though there is meaning, as though life has purpose. But in the scale of the void, those actions vanish. A civilization's rise is less than a spark in a windless cave. The loss of a loved one, the most personal agony, is unheard, unmarked, unnoticed. The stars remain unmoved. Religion, philosophy, story, all are human attempts to wrap silence in language. To name the unnameable. To shine light into a cavern that may have no bottom. And for a time, they work. They comfort. They guide. But eventually, the edges fray. The stories contradict. The philosophies collapse. And behind them, still, is silence. That silence is not hostile. It is not an enemy. It does not attack. But in its presence, many crumble. For the heart longs for meaning as lungs long for air. The desire for purpose burns in the mind like a candle in a cold room. And the absence of an answer does not kill the question. It immortalizes it. The idea that there is no grand plan, no hidden wisdom, no cosmic justice, that all things occur because they must, not because they should, is a weight not all can carry. But it is also a strange liberation. If there is no assigned meaning, then meaning becomes a creation. Not discovered, but built. Not uncovered, but invented. Laughter may not echo in the void, but it still matters to those who laugh. Grief may not be honored by the stars, but it still carves the soul. And beauty, fleeting and fragile, may not change the fate of the universe, but it changes the breath of a single moment. In the face of cosmic silence, the smallest kindness becomes a rebellion, the smallest joy, an act of defiance. Yet the silence remains, and sometimes, in its depth, it offers a kind of peace, a stillness untouched by judgment, a quiet too vast for fear. In that void, all are equal, all are lost, all are free. No punishment waits beyond the stars, no reward, only the hum of emptiness, only the endless night. And perhaps that is enough. To live not for a plan, but for presence, not for reward, but for resonance. To speak into the void, knowing it will not answer, and to speak anyway. To move through the silence, not in search of meaning, but as meaning itself. A brief light in endless dark, a soft voice in infinite stillness. The silence does not speak, but it also does not lie. Nihilistic determinism. There may never have been a choice. Every gesture, every breath, every decision lined up long before it was made. Like dominoes arranged by hands unseen, the path was set from the beginning. Not just the path, but the pace, the rhythm, the exact angle at which each piece would fall. The illusion of free will dances beautifully in the mind, but beneath its flowing movements lies the machinery of inevitability. Thought, emotion, desire, all may be chemistry and history unfolding in sequence. The pull toward love, the flash of anger, the need to run, the longing to stay, all reactions in a system too complex to perceive in real time. But complexity does not mean chaos. Even the most elaborate storm has a structure. So too, the mind. The rebellion that seems spontaneous may have been written in the bones, in the blood, in the childhood forgotten, and the ancestors never known. Every smile, no matter how genuine, may have bloomed precisely when it was always going to. The words spoken in kindness, the ones screamed in regret, the silence held too long or not long enough, all may be prescripted, not by an author in the sky, but by the convergence of genetics, trauma, circumstance, and time. And yet the script feels alive, because it unfolds within awareness. The puppet believes it dances freely because it cannot see the strings. Even the impulse to resist this idea, to say there must be freedom somewhere, may itself be a programmed response. A defense mechanism triggered automatically when identity feels threatened. But what is identity in a world without freedom? Perhaps it is a byproduct, a reflection, a convincing shadow cast by a series of necessary neural firings. The criminal and the saint, in this thought, are not opposites, but outcomes. Their paths as inevitable as rain hitting the ground. Praise and blame become decorations pinned on inevitability. Justice becomes theater. Punishment becomes ritual. The judge and the judged, both captives in the same system, both driven by mechanisms as hidden as they are precise. Morality loses its footing here. If every action was always going to happen, then virtue is not a triumph, and sin is not a fall. They are both destinations reached by tracks laid in silence, long before the traveler stepped onto the platform. The hero is not heroic, only inevitable. The villain is not monstrous, only unfolding. And yet, even within this mechanical vision, there is a strange kind of comfort. Nothing was ever truly lost, because nothing could have ever been otherwise. The regrets carried in quiet hours become softened, not by forgiveness, but by understanding. The wrong turn, the sharp word, the final goodbye, it was all built into the system. It was all the only way it could be. The mind still dreams of freedom. It dreams of sudden changes, spontaneous awakenings, bold leaps off the track. But even those may be outcomes, not choices. The awakening timed perfectly. The leap calculated by algorithms the dreamer will never see. The sense of transcendence pre-written. The puppet dances, and the strings are invisible. But the dance is beautiful all the same. Pascal's wager, reversed. The wager is ancient. Believe, just in case. Believe in the divine, in salvation, in reward. Better to be wrong and gain nothing than to disbelieve and risk eternal loss. But what if the premise itself is inverted? What if belief is not the path to salvation, but the test? What if trust is the trap and doubt is the door? In this reversal, the divine does not desire worship. It studies it, watches it, measures its spread like a fungus in the dark. Every bowed head, every whispered prayer, every unquestioning loyalty, a sign not of wisdom, but of infection. Belief in this thought becomes a symptom, and the cure is skepticism. The one who resists the pull of certainty, who questions the smiling preacher, who walks away from temples with hands empty and eyes open, this one passes the test. Not because of rebellion, but because of refusal. The refusal to kneel before what cannot be known. The refusal to claim knowledge of the infinite. The refusal to trade doubt for comfort. Perhaps the divine in this vision is not a being, but a law. A filter through which consciousness is sifted. Those who believe without evidence are caught. Those who demand clarity, who do not pretend to know what cannot be known, are allowed to pass through. Belief becomes ballast. Doubt becomes the wind. The trap is elegant. It offers comfort, community, the warm illusion of knowing. And those who take it feel safe, even as the bars of the cage close softly around their minds. To believe blindly is to surrender curiosity, to accept answers wrapped in gold and silence all further questions. But the silence is not peace. It is sedation. In this view, every prophet is watched. Every sacred text is noted. And the true test lies not in how many followers are gathered, but in how many escape. Not by force, not by anger, but by stepping quietly away from the glow and into the unknown. The divine may not speak, because the absence of answers is part of the examination. The test is not passed by knowing, but by acknowledging that knowing is impossible. Faith becomes easy, doubt becomes courage, and courage becomes salvation. Perhaps the final judgment is not a throne, but a mirror. The believer, staring into it, sees only reflections of what was borrowed. A life shaped by others' ideas, by inherited rituals, by second-hand convictions. The skeptic sees nothing, but in that nothing, freedom. A space where nothing was assumed. A space where the mind remained its own. And if there is a reward, it is not paradise. It is understanding. The realization that the game was not to believe, but to see through belief. That the prize was not heaven, but autonomy. And the key was always hidden in the question never asked aloud. What if faith is the true temptation? The wager flips, and the house does not win. Eternal oblivion. There may be nothing after death. No light, no tunnel, no final breath followed by revelation. Just stillness so total it erases the concept of stillness. Beyond death, there may be no awareness of the passing, no sense of loss or gain. No feeling of departure, because departure requires presence, and presence is the first thing to vanish. Time itself, the river that carried everything once known, ends not with a bend, but with a disappearance. In this vision, death is not a gate to another world. It is not a transformation, not a continuation, not a resting place. It is absence in its most complete form. Not a sleep, because even sleep has dreams. Not a void, because even a void has space. It is the termination of consciousness so complete that even the memory of having ever been conscious fades like mist before sunlight that will never rise again. The self, long clung to like a treasured photograph, dissolves. Not violently, not suddenly, simply and inevitably. The concept of a self, with a name, a voice, a story, melts into unreality. There is no reunion, no judgment, no final accounting. No one remains to remember or be remembered. The idea of being ends in a silence so total it can never be heard. To those who still live, this may seem terrifying, but terror is a product of expectation, and expectation cannot survive death. The fear of oblivion exists only within the living. The dead feel nothing, and so, if there is peace, it is not the peace of calm or resolution. It is the peace of total unbeing, a kind of release that even the word freedom cannot describe, because freedom implies an observer to experience it. The stars still burn. The rivers still move. The world continues, indifferent and unchanged. But the observer who once watched the stars, who once stood beside the rivers, has vanished. Not moved, not relocated, not transformed. Vanished in the way a flame disappears when the candle goes out. The wax remains. The air cools. But the flame is gone, and it leaves no shadow. And in that disappearance, perhaps there is something sublime. No judgment awaits. No regrets trail behind. The burdens of thought, of memory, of longing, dissolve. The weight carried across years of life falls away in a single instant that is not even an instant, because time has ceased. Oblivion has no beginning and no end. It is not a state. It is the absence of all states. There is no need for fear. There is no need for comfort. Both are constructs of minds that no longer exist. What remains is nothing. Not empty space, not silence, not rest. Just the absence of presence. The end of questioning, not because answers were found, but because the questioner no longer exists. And in this ultimate vanishing, perhaps there is a strange form of purity. No one remains to suffer. No one remains to be disappointed. No one remains to ask, what comes next? Because next has lost its meaning. The circle of life closes not in completion, but in disappearance. and no one notices because there is no one left to notice. Antinatalism. To be born is to be thrown into the world without consent. A scream pulled from lungs that never asked to breathe, eyes forced open to a world of hunger and ache, of cold mornings and heavy nights. Antinatalism begins with this premise: that existence is not a gift, but a burden. That life is not a miracle, but an imposition. The idea that to never exist is better than to suffer, and all who are born must suffer, eventually, always. There is beauty, yes. There is laughter and sunrise, music and love. But they do not erase pain. They decorate it. They do not cure grief. They soften it for a moment before it returns in waves. For every joy, there are 10 silent agonies: the weight of mortality, the terror of loss, the grinding pressure of time, the cruelty of accident, the betrayal of the body. Life is not a steady dance, but a stuttering walk through fire and snow. And every life ends. Always. That is the rule none escape. To be born is to be sentenced. Not by an angry God, not by a vengeful fate, but by biology, by inertia, by the simple fact of having a beginning. And in this thought, the beginning is the crime. The cry of a newborn is not celebration. It is protest. Life begins in need, and it ends in silence. No child asks to be made. Every birth is a gamble made by another, and some will suffer more than others, without reason, without fairness, without explanation. Some will never know safety. Some will never know love. Even the most fortunate will lose everything, slowly or suddenly. The moment the first breath is drawn, the clock begins to tick. If pain outweighs joy, then each new life is a risk, and the math becomes terrifying. A parent hopes for health, for happiness, for safety. But hope cannot prevent accident. Hope cannot undo heartbreak. Hope cannot keep death from circling. And if hope fails, the child suffers, and had no say in the wager that created the possibility of that suffering. In this vision, compassion means prevention. The deepest kindness is to stop the cycle. To say, no one will suffer because no one will be born to suffer. This is not a rejection of love. It is the highest form of it. To look at a broken world and refuse to bring another into it. To see the storm and not send a boat into it, no matter how beautiful the sails might be. The stars do not mourn those never born. The sky is not emptier because a voice was never raised toward it. The soil is not poorer because no feet walked upon it. Nature remains unmoved by absence. And perhaps in that absence, something sacred can grow. Silence without sorrow. A peace untroubled by screams. There is no hatred in this thought. Only quiet resignation. The understanding that life is powerful, but also perilous. That love is beautiful, but not enough. That joy is fleeting, and pain is inevitable. And if existence cannot be chosen freely, then the greatest mercy may be non-existence. Some will say this thought is darkness, but perhaps it is simply the night before dawn, the deep silence that asks whether more suffering is necessary, or whether, just this once, the cycle can stop and the world can rest. The death of the author. A voice speaks, and in that moment, meaning is whole. But the moment the words leave the mouth, they begin to die. They float into the air, into the world, and from that point forward, they no longer belong to the one who gave them breath. Interpretation slices them open. Context distorts them. The listener carries them elsewhere, into memory, into bias, into silence. The death of the author is not a moment of violence, but one of evaporation. A sentence on a page is no longer a message. It is a mirror, a prism, a vessel. One reader sees love, another sees warning. One hears rebellion, another hears surrender. The original intent, so carefully crafted, is buried under layers of perception. The author becomes irrelevant, a ghost at the edge of the conversation. The meaning continues without them, transformed into something they never imagined, something they may not even recognize. In this thought, every poem becomes 1,000 poems. Every sacred text becomes a battlefield. Every theory becomes an ideology. Every simple phrase becomes a labyrinth. And in that labyrinth, no thread leads back to the author. The writer cannot call the reader back, cannot correct the misreading, cannot prevent the text from becoming something else, somewhere else. Words, once released, are like ashes in the wind. What begins in clarity ends in confusion. The story of a love lost becomes a rallying cry. The cry of despair becomes an anthem. The metaphor of flight becomes a religion. Meaning mutates. Intention decays. And still the words are read, quoted, dissected, and worshipped, not for what they were, but for what others believe they mean now. This loss of control is not a flaw. It is a feature. It is the way meaning lives beyond the one who gave it shape. But it is also the way meaning dies. If 1,000 interpretations all contradict, which is true? Perhaps none. Perhaps all. Perhaps the only truth is that there is no fixed truth. The text is not a vessel of certainty. It is a field of fragments, endlessly rearranged. Even conversation suffers this fracture. A voice says one thing, meaning only kindness, and the listener hears judgment. Another voice jokes, meaning only levity, and the listener hears cruelty. Every word is a gamble. Every silence, an ambiguity. Communication is a game played with smoke and shadows, and the author always loses the moment the message is released. And so the writer, the speaker, the creator, must die to the work, must vanish, must surrender. The words are no longer theirs. The meaning is no longer fixed. The audience makes the meaning now, with their own fears, hopes, wounds, and dreams. And what they create from the bones of the original intent may be more beautiful or more terrible than the creator ever imagined. Some texts survive this dismemberment. Others are destroyed by it, but none remain intact. Every story is broken by the act of being read. Every meaning is scattered by the act of being understood. And the author, no matter how loud, cannot be heard clearly through the static of interpretation. Perhaps nothing ever meant what it was meant to. Perhaps language is not a bridge, but a forest. And every word spoken is a path that leads away, not toward. The death of the author is not a tragedy. It is the truth. Meaning lives. But it does not live where it began. Time as a prison. The clock ticks forward, but the body stays still. Time moves like a line, always forward, never back. But the line may be a cage. The present is never caught, only glimpsed. The future is always arriving, always out of reach. The past is always fading, always unreachable. And this movement, so relentless, becomes a kind of confinement. Memories vanish, not because they are unimportant, but because the rules of the timeline erase them. A beautiful afternoon, once real, is now only fragments in the mind. A conversation that changed everything now floats like dust in the corners of thought. The hug that felt eternal is gone, unreachable, unrepeatable. The past becomes myth, even when it is personal. It becomes rumor, and no amount of desire can bring it back. The future, too, is a kind of prison. It demands anticipation. It demands planning. It creates anxiety in advance. It writes scripts for scenes not yet played, and offers no promise that those scenes will unfold. And yet everything is built around it. Hope, fear, ambition, all tethered to what does not yet exist. The future looms like a wall, and every step taken is toward it, whether welcome or not. The present, so praised, so mythologized, can never be held. The instant it is noticed, it is already gone. The moment of wonder passes before it can be named. The breath felt deeply is already the next breath. The world never stops moving. Time does not pause. The prisoner cannot rest, because even stillness is made of passing seconds. Time is not just motion, it is boundary. It says, no returning, no repeating, no undoing. The decision made cannot be unmade. The word spoken cannot be unheard. The love lost cannot be found again in the same form. Regret becomes a permanent weight, because the path cannot be retraced. And even joy, once past, becomes a ghost. Birth opens the cell. Death closes it. In between, the prisoner walks the hallway of seconds, counting each one without realizing it. Some days rush forward, others drag, but none repeat. And in that relentless movement, life begins to feel like a sentence rather than a song. If time is a construct, then perhaps it is a cruel one. A law written into the bones of reality, impossible to appeal, impossible to break. Even dreams are bound by it. Even imagination must obey its current. And though memory pretends to reach back, it offers only sketches, never substance, never return. Yet in this confinement, something else arises. A strange intensity, a reverence. Because what is fleeting becomes sacred. What is vanishing becomes precious. A smile, a scent, a song, all are known to be temporary, and so they become altars of the present. The prison becomes a cathedral, the seconds become candles, and life becomes a kind of worship. But still, the walls remain. Still, the past is locked. Still, the future looms, and the present slips like water through fingers. Time does not stop. And so the prisoner walks on, one breath at a time, under a sky that forgets as easily as it burns. The hollow mask of identity. The mirror reflects a face, but the face may not belong. It smiles when expected, furrows at the proper time, nods in agreement when silence would be too loud. The name spoken aloud feels familiar, but not absolute. The voice sounds right, but only because it has been heard so many times. And beneath it all lies a suspicion that the person known as the self is not a single thing, but a collection of impressions layered one over the other like dust, like paint, like skin that has never truly touched the core. Identity begins as imitation. The language spoken, the gestures learned, the tone of laughter, all borrowed. Some from parents, some from strangers, some from songs, from television, from quiet observations made without even knowing they were made. The self becomes an echo of other selves, arranged into something that feels whole only because the pieces have been assembled for so long. Habits form, reactions solidify, opinions harden, but each one may not have been chosen, only absorbed. The fear of being disliked, the desire to be praised, the avoidance of shame. These are not the roots of self. They are the pressures that shape the mask. Reward polishes it, punishment carves it, culture frames it, and soon the mask smiles back from the mirror as if it were the one looking. If pulled gently, the layers begin to peel. The accent slips, the posture falters, the beliefs tremble when held too tightly. What seemed certain becomes soft. What seemed stable begins to blur. And beneath the layers, where something true should be waiting, there may be only silence. Not absence, not emptiness, just a lack of anything fixed. A centerless swirl of impressions. The stories told about the self, where it came from, what it wants, what it fears, may be just that. Stories. Narratives stitched together from selective memories and unconscious edits. Each retelling reshapes the tale. The narrator becomes unreliable, not from malice, but from fragmentation. And the self, listening to the story, begins to suspect it was never the author. Some seek a true identity beneath the mask, a core that cannot be shaken. But what if the search is in vain? What if the self is not a hidden jewel, but a performance without an audience? A mask worn for so long that no one remembers the actor. Perhaps the actor never existed. Perhaps the mask is all there ever was. Yet even in this hollowness, there is something strangely gentle, a freedom in the realization that the self is not fixed, that the person seen today is not bound to who existed yesterday, that identity is not destiny, but possibility. The mask can change, the story can pause, and in that pause, there is space. The self in the mirror may not be real, but it has learned to feel. It has known loss. It has laughed. It has reached out, even if what reached was not stable. The mask may be hollow, but it has touched the world, and perhaps that is enough. Not to be true, but to be present. The Fermi Paradox's bleak answer. The night sky is filled with stars, hundreds of billions in each galaxy, and galaxies beyond counting. The numbers suggest a truth that feels inevitable. There should be others. Other minds, other civilizations, other voices whispering across the dark. But the radio waves fall silent. The telescopes return only stillness. The universe answers with absence. And so the question grows louder. Where is everyone? The Fermi Paradox offers the question. The silence offers the answer. Life may not be rare. Life may be common, inevitable, prolific. But intelligence, true intelligence, may be a fire that burns too hot, too fast. Civilizations may arise, flourish, and then fall before they can speak. Not because they are weak, but because they are powerful. Not because they are alone, but because they are capable of self-erasure. The silence is not emptiness. It is aftermath. A graveyard stretched across light years. Planets once bright with architecture, now cold with dust. Voices once raised in discovery, now swallowed by radiation and collapse. The great filter is not ahead. It is behind. Passed silently, unknowingly. And the survivors, if any remain, sit in the dark, listening to a quiet that sounds like destiny. Technology grows faster than wisdom. Knowledge outpaces restraint. A species learns to split atoms before it learns to share food. It connects continents before it connects hearts. It deciphers DNA before it understands compassion. The result is inevitable. The weapons sharpen faster than the treaties. The climate shifts before the warnings are heeded. The silence grows before the first signal finishes traveling. Each civilization may think itself different, smarter, kinder, wiser. But the pattern may be written into the rise. Intelligence leads to tools. Tools lead to dominance. Dominance leads to blindness. And soon the sky goes silent again. Some may have screamed. Some may have tried. Their voices may still be traveling, broken fragments of desperate song drifting through the void, too faint to be heard. Or perhaps they chose silence, knowing the risk. Perhaps they turned inward, chose isolation, chose to hide. But hiding cannot last forever, and silence is not survival, it is just delay. The universe remains quiet not because it is empty, but because it is filled with ghosts. The stars do not mourn them. The planets do not remember them. But their absence is everywhere. Every blank patch of sky, every unanswered signal, every flicker of static. The cosmos is a choir where every voice has gone hoarse. Perhaps the tragedy is not that no one is out there. Perhaps the tragedy is that everyone was. Once. The inverted golden rule. The ancient ideal once whispered softly. Treat others as one would wish to be treated. A universal ethic, shining with the fragile hope that kindness could self-perpetuate, that mercy could spark mercy, that goodness could circle back to its giver. But now the light in that rule fades, inverted and hollowed. Treat others as they treat others. Not as they treat the self, but as they treat the world. If cruelty is their currency, respond in kind. If they deceive, deceive them. If they harm, reflect it back. Morality shifts from a standard to a strategy. In this inversion, compassion becomes not an instinct, but a liability. Empathy, once celebrated, becomes dangerous. The open hand becomes a target. The gentle voice becomes drowned in harder tones. Justice ceases to be about balance and becomes instead a copy of behavior. A mirror with no mercy. Reciprocity wrapped in vengeance. Eye for eye, then tooth for tooth, then soul for soul. What begins as defense morphs into doctrine. Every person becomes judge, jury, reflection. Every interaction is weighed against past transgressions, not by the self alone, but by how the other behaves toward others. If one is cruel to a stranger, the conclusion is swift. No kindness deserved here. If generosity is selective, then compassion will be too. Every soul judged by its patterns, every kindness earned, every cruelty reflected. Forgiveness loses its home. Civilization splinters under this code, no longer governed by shared values, but by shifting personal algorithms. Every heart becomes its own courtroom. Ethics become conditional, transactional. The gentle become hardened, the hardened become cynical. Not because of evil, but because of exhaustion. Survival requires reflection. Mercy becomes currency too expensive to spend freely. This way of being spreads quietly. At first it seems like justice, people receiving what they give. But justice twists, subtly, until it becomes punishment without end. A cycle of reaction. A loop of harm justified by precedent. The one who turns away first from kindness now casts a long shadow behind them. And everyone who sees that shadow prepares to throw their own. The inverted rule demands surveillance. Every person watching every other. Every action logged in the subconscious as evidence. Every act weighed for future treatment. The world becomes a ledger. Relationships become exchanges. Intimacy is no longer rooted in trust, but in performance. Trust only given to those who have proven it to others, never assumed, never offered first. Empathy begins to wither. It freezes in the cold wind of retaliation. The part of the heart that once opened without reason, that once saw the broken behind the cruel, that once offered grace instead of judgment, that part becomes silent. It no longer speaks, because the world no longer listens. Mercy becomes weakness. Kindness becomes suspicion. And the soul learns to armor itself, not with virtue, but with symmetry. Treat others as they treat others. This becomes the chant. And in this chant, a civilization forgets what it means to begin again. To forgive. To offer goodness without needing it returned. The golden rule, once inverted, does not create harmony. It creates mirrors in which every wound reflects until no one remembers who hurt whom first. Moral luck. A choice is made. It feels right. It follows principle. It reflects thought, care, even love. But elsewhere, in another place, another time, another twist of circumstance, that same choice would lead to harm. Ethics begins to unravel when chance enters the room. When outcomes, not intentions, become the measure of morality. When the good are praised only if luck allows the result to match the intention. When the cruel are condemned not for what they meant, but for what happened to follow. This is the paradox. The kindness offered today may blossom into beauty, or it may trigger catastrophe. The same action, the same tone, the same hand held out, praise in one timeline, punishment in another. The good decision becomes a coin toss. The moral act becomes a dice roll, and ethics begins to tremble, not from within, but from the chaos that surrounds it. A driver slows to help a stranger and is rear-ended by fate. A surgeon takes a risk to save a life and fails by inches. A parent disciplines a child with care and sees that child break anyway. None of these are failures of character. But the judgment will still come, because morality, in the eyes of others, often wears the mask of results. The sinner, too, is subject to luck. A theft that saves a family, a lie that prevents a war, an act of violence that stops a greater one. The world sometimes bends so strangely that cruelty yields compassion. And justice, if built only on outcome, begins to collapse under its own contradictions. If luck rules morality, then virtue becomes unstable. The best intentions are not enough. The purest motives cannot guarantee redemption. Goodness becomes a wheel spun each morning, and the winners are the ones who land on the right number, regardless of their soul. This thought frays the edge of every decision. Doubt creeps in. Is this right, or does it only seem right because fortune smiles today? Would it still be right if the outcome changed? If goodness is measured by effect, then every moral compass spins, and if it is measured by intent, then the world's judgment becomes cruel. There is no answer that settles this. Only a tension that remains. Every act becomes a gamble, every virtue a risk, every judgment partial. And the question lingers in the silence after each choice. What if this turns out wrong, despite everything? Some turn away, others double down, some grow cautious, others grow bitter. But the paradox holds. The line between saint and sinner is sometimes no wider than a single, uncontrollable event. Ethics becomes a house built on shifting sand, and those who try to walk upright in it must do so knowing that the storm may come, not because of failure, but because of randomness. And still, the steps are taken, not because the outcome can be guaranteed, but because not walking at all is worse. Virtue remains, fragile, trembling, but alive, even if luck laughs in its face. Cosmic indifference. The universe watches nothing. It listens to nothing. It does not punish. It does not reward. It is not cruel, and it is not kind. It is simply vast. It is silence stretched across incomprehensible distance. Stars are born, blaze brilliantly, and collapse into frozen remnants without ceremony. Galaxies spiral into themselves and vanish into blackness without song. The beauty seen in the night sky is not intentional, it is incidental. The universe does not paint for eyes to witness. It does not create for hearts to feel. What exists, exists. Nothing more. Joy in this vastness does not echo. Suffering does not ripple outward into space. The death of a species is not mourned by the void. The achievements of minds are not recorded in the fabric of time. There are no trophies, no medals, no heavenly applause. A symphony composed and a scream of agony both vanish into the same quiet. The stars remain unchanged. This is not malice. Malice requires intent. There is no intent here. Only motion. Energy drifting, matter colliding, particles entangling and dissolving. The rules are followed because they must be, because there is no other option. No will moves them. Gravity does not care. Light does not hesitate. And entropy has no conscience. It takes all and keeps nothing. Meaning, in this world, is not absent. It is irrelevant. It does not factor into the equation. The orbit of a moon does not depend on the hope of its observer. The formation of a planet does not answer any prayer. The existence of life is not a plan. It is an accident, or perhaps just one of infinite possibilities that briefly flickered into being and will just as quickly extinguish. The urge to be seen, to be understood, to matter, that urge burns brightly within small corners of this uncaring sky. Minds long to connect with something greater, something that listens. But the stars do not respond. The vastness does not lean closer. Silence answers every plea, not because the plea is ignored, but because there was no one to hear it in the first place. Still, existence continues. Still, thought persists. Still, kindness is shared. Not because it is required, or seen, or rewarded, but because within the brief span of awareness, some choose to create warmth anyway, a campfire lit in a snowstorm, a song sung in a canyon that will never echo back, a gesture made not to be remembered, but to be real. In the face of indifference, meaning becomes an act of defiance, not imposed from above, not granted by the stars, but shaped in the quiet places between breaths. A child comforted, a poem written, a seed planted. These do not change the cosmos, but they change the moment, and that may be all that matters. The universe does not care, but that does not mean care cannot exist within it. The tragedy of the commons. The land is shared. The water is shared. The air, the ocean, the soil, the quiet places between, shared. A common space, held by all and claimed by none. And at first, there is balance. One takes only what is needed. One waits before consuming. One plants after harvesting. But then the math begins. The quiet calculation. If others take more, why not take more in return? If restraint is not rewarded, then indulgence is not punished. The balance tips. Each individual decision makes sense. Each step appears rational. The field has grass. The river has fish. The sky can carry more smoke. And the more that is taken, the more advantage is gained, until everyone begins to take. Not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of being left with nothing. And the tragedy begins. The commons, once rich, begins to wither. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in increments too small to notice until it is too late. The grass grows thin, the fish vanish, the air thickens, and everyone looks around, sees the damage, understands it, and keeps taking. Because stopping alone changes nothing. One's own restraint will not save what others are still consuming. And so the cycle continues. Logic betrays survival. Cooperation breaks beneath competition. The tragedy is not that people are evil. The tragedy is that people are afraid. Afraid of being the last one to take. Afraid of being the only one to stop. Even knowing the end is collapse, the decision is made. Better to take now, while there is still something left. This pattern repeats. In forests, in oceans, in economies, in relationships. Anywhere there is something shared and no one to protect it, the tragedy waits. A quiet seed that grows into decay. A future that everyone sees but no one avoids. Because avoidance requires trust, and trust, once broken, is rarely rebuilt. Even when the collapse begins, the logic remains. The voice says, "It is already broken, so what does it matter if one more tree falls? If one more bucket is drawn from the well? If one more silence is filled with noise?" And in this way, the ruin becomes complete. Not by one act, but by thousands. Each one justified. Each one defensible. Each one part of a pattern no one can stop alone. There is no villain in this tragedy. Only systems without safeguards. Only minds trained to survive, not to share. Only lives shaped by scarcity, trying to thrive in a world where abundance requires trust that no longer exists. And still, some plant anyway. Some clean. Some hold back. Not because they believe it will be enough, but because they cannot bear to add to the loss. A tree watered knowing it may not survive. A shoreline cleared knowing it may be covered again. A kindness done in the face of collapse. The tragedy is real. But so is the refusal to surrender completely. And perhaps that, too, is part of the story. The unreliability of memory. The past is not a place. It is not a shelf where moments are stored, preserved in pristine clarity. It is a dream retold by a voice inside the mind, a storyteller who forgets the script and improvises each time the curtain rises. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. And each time it is recalled, it is rebuilt. Slightly different, slightly skewed. Shifted by time, emotion, suggestion, and the quiet rewriting that takes place in the shadows of thought. What was once certain becomes blurred. A name remembered perfectly one day feels unfamiliar the next. A room once filled with warmth now echoes with confusion. The colors of a summer afternoon change shades with every telling. And eventually, the line between what happened and what is believed to have happened disappears. Even sacred moments are vulnerable. The first touch of a loved one's hand, the final words spoken before goodbye, the sound of laughter in a childhood kitchen. These seem untouchable, solid, anchored. But they too shift. A detail lost, a sentence altered, a feeling invented after the fact. Emotion seeps into the memory and reshapes it like water in clay. And what was once truth becomes story. This is not failure. It is function. The mind does not store. It retells. And in each retelling, something is polished, something is added, something is lost. Context vanishes. Motivation is assumed. And the self that remembers is not the self that lived the moment. A new mind looks back through an old lens, and the past is reframed. Photographs help little. A picture captures a face, but not the thoughts behind the eyes. A recording captures a voice, but not the trembling underneath it. Objects carried through time become symbols, not evidence. Proof fades. What remains is narrative. Sometimes the narrative is kind. It softens the pain. It adds meaning where none existed. It fills in silence with purpose. Other times, it is cruel. It distorts joy into longing. It turns mistakes into monsters. It rewrites failures into fixed identities. And the worst part is the certainty. The belief that the memory is true, even when it is not. Witnesses contradict. Diaries betray their authors. Siblings remember the same childhood in opposite colors. Time bends, and the truth becomes plural. The past is not one story, it is many. Each person writes their own version, and each one believes it is the only one. This leaves a strange emptiness. If the past cannot be trusted, then what anchors the self? What defines growth, change, identity? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps the self is simply the latest edition of a story constantly being rewritten. Not better or worse, just different. And perhaps that is enough. To remember with care, but not with certainty. To honor what might have happened, while holding space for what might not have. To see memory not as history, but as myth. A living myth, reshaped with each breath, never finished, never fixed. The Bootstrap Paradox. A book lies open, its pages filled with words that shaped a mind. That mind, in time, writes the same book, word for word, and sends it back through time. The book becomes the original, the inspiration, the source. But the question burns quietly beneath the ink. Who wrote it? If cause leads to effect, and effect becomes cause, then the loop closes in on itself. The origin disappears. The creation has no creator. The beginning has no beginning. It just is. And from that isness, logic begins to unravel. A song taught by a traveler who learned it from a child, who learned it from that same traveler. A machine invented by studying its own blueprint. A being who meets its maker, only to discover that it became the maker. The paradox blooms like a flower in reverse, petals curling inward until nothing remains at the center. Causality, so deeply trusted, so deeply embedded in thought, becomes unreliable. Time ceases to be a line. It becomes a circle, a spiral, a knot. Past and future tangle. Origins vanish. Everything exists because it already existed. And in that loop, identity becomes blurred. If a creation births its own creator, then what is the role of choice? What is the shape of intention? The paradox offers no comfort. It is not meant to. It is meant to reveal a fracture in understanding, a doorway into the absurd. where everything that exists may do so without a beginning, where the arrow of time bends backward and pierces its own bow, where questions cannot be answered because the answers themselves are the questions. And yet, the loop persists. It holds. The book continues to be read. The machine continues to be built. The child continues to hum the song. The impossibility does not prevent the reality. The paradox is not a flaw. It is a feature of a universe that does not always obey the mind's need for sequence. There is a kind of beauty in this, a mystery that cannot be solved, only held. A story that tells itself forever, with no author, no first page, no last. Only the middle, looping endlessly, asking quietly, does it matter where it began, if it always was? Everything begins nowhere, and from that nowhere, everything comes. The paradox of tolerance. A society declares itself tolerant, open, inclusive, a haven for all beliefs, all voices, all perspectives. But then comes the test. A voice enters not to join, but to dismantle. It demands space not to be heard, but to silence others. It seeks tolerance, not as a right, but as a weapon. And the society must choose. To allow the intolerant is to risk collapse. To deny them is to betray its own principles. Thus, the paradox begins. Tolerance, in order to survive, must set limits. It must draw a line. But the moment a line is drawn, the purity of tolerance is broken. The promise becomes conditional. The sanctuary gains guards. The contradiction grows visible. To remain open, certain doors must be closed. The danger is not always clear. Intolerance does not always shout. It whispers first. It smiles. It speaks of tradition, of order, of values lost. It asks not for domination, only for space. And once it is given that space, it begins to expand. It rewrites tolerance as submission. It turns openness into weakness. It demands silence from those it cannot yet control. To reject intolerance feels like betrayal, but to accept it is worse. A slow erosion begins. Minorities shrink into silence. Justice bends. Fear grows louder than reason. The tolerant begin to wonder if their own compassion has become a noose. So exclusion becomes necessary, not as cruelty, but as protection. Not as vengeance, but as boundary. And that exclusion bruises the ideal. The dream of absolute acceptance falters. The society realizes it cannot accept all things if it hopes to survive. It must choose whom to tolerate. And in that choice, it becomes something else. The loop tightens. The more tolerance defends itself, the more it resembles what it once opposed. It polices, it censors, it hardens. And some begin to question whether anything was ever truly open at all. But the alternative is worse. To do nothing is to allow the intolerant to take the floor, then the room, then the world. There is no clean answer, no resolution without compromise. Tolerance, to remain true, must contradict itself. It must act against the very instinct that defines it. Peace demands paradox. The ideal must be wounded to be preserved. And even in victory, the scar remains. In the name of openness, a door must be closed. Brain in a vat. There is a brain, suspended in fluid. Electrodes pierce the soft tissue, feeding signals to every neuron. Light, sound, texture, all illusions. Everything it senses has been crafted by a machine, precise and tireless. The brain twitches, believes, perceives. It thinks it walks. It thinks it speaks. It thinks it remembers a childhood, a family, a world. But it never left the jar. It never had a body. It never saw the sky. This is not science fiction. It is a philosophical trap, a question that cannot be escaped. How can the mind know what is real if all it has ever known are its own signals? The colors seen could be algorithms. The warmth felt could be code. The voice heard could be nothing more than sound waves carefully fed into the right synapses. There is no way to test the jar from within it. Every method of measurement, every tool of inquiry is part of the simulation. Even doubt itself can be simulated. Skepticism may simply be another programmed response. The very question, "Is this real?" might be part of the illusion's design. The world feels consistent, but consistency does not prove truth. A dream can be consistent. A hallucination can be intricate. A simulation can be perfect. And in this thought, the possibility grows. Perhaps everything is simulated. Not just the senses, but the thoughts about the senses. Not just the memories, but the memories of having remembered them. The self, in this vision, becomes lonely, surrounded by nothing except its own manufactured reality. No other minds, no real space, just patterns interpreted as people, trees, wind, laughter. The smell of the ocean might be an invention. The face of a loved one, a stored image. A life, imagined with such depth it forgets that it began in fluid and wire. Escape is impossible, because even the idea of escape could be part of the program. A clever trick to simulate curiosity, a safeguard to keep the brain questioning while still believing. The illusion of freedom, nested perfectly within the illusion of reality. The mind rebels, of course. It clings to the world it knows. The texture of a blanket, the taste of coffee, the ache in the knees after a long day. Surely these things are too specific, too subtle to be fake. But perhaps the machine is subtle. Perhaps it has studied the brain long enough to know exactly what to show it. Perhaps this reality is tailored perfectly to convince its one inhabitant that it is not alone. In this scenario, the question becomes not what is real, but does it matter? If the brain feels joy, even in illusion, is that joy false? If a love is experienced, even if the lover never existed, is the love meaningless? If a life is lived, even in a jar, is it less than any other? The answer never comes. The wires hum, the signals pulse, the thoughts continue, and the brain, floating quietly, dreams on. The cannibalism of time. Time does not pass. It devours. Moment by moment, it consumes everything that exists. Not all at once, not in a single bite, but slowly, methodically, in silence. Childhood vanishes first, not with violence, but with erosion. The toys fade, the colors dim, the laughter changes tone. What once felt eternal becomes memory, then dream, then shadow. And even the shadows stretch thin before disappearing altogether. Love, too, is eaten. The first spark, the first kiss, the long talks beneath a shared sky, each one swallowed. Not erased, but metabolized into the past. A photo curled at the edges, a scent that no longer matches the name it once summoned. A voice once memorized, now uncertain in echo. Love becomes fossil, delicate and partial. Even memory itself is not spared. The mind tries to preserve, to archive, to protect. But time reaches inward. It alters recollections, corrodes clarity. What was once vivid becomes soft. What was once certain becomes questioned. Time edits without consent. It rewrites without warning. It feeds even on the act of remembering. Mountains crumble under it. Oceans shift. The stars themselves yield. Galaxies drift apart, cold and wordless, as time stretches its reach across light years. Nothing resists it forever. Not stone, not flame, not thought. The second that just passed is already consumed. The one arriving next arrives only to be devoured in turn. There is no place to hide. The body ages, cell by cell, regardless of effort. The skin thins, the bones whisper, the eyes forget how bright the world once seemed. Every heartbeat is borrowed. Every breath a brief defiance. But even defiance cannot starve time. It only slows its chewing, never stops it. And yet life continues, despite the hunger surrounding it, despite the inevitability of being eaten. Perhaps this, too, is part of the design. The rose blooms not to last, but to be remembered. The song is sung not to echo forever, but to soften the moment before it is gone. Life becomes beautiful not in spite of time, but because of it. Knowing that time consumes all makes each fragment more sacred. A smile, a silence, a snowfall, all destined to vanish. And still, they are chosen. Still, they are lived. Still, they are created. Not to survive, but to exist before being taken. Time will eat everything, but it cannot undo the fact that it happened. Negative utilitarianism. The scale of suffering is vast. Every moment somewhere, pain blooms. A cracked rib, a failed heartbeat, a scream that no one hears. Even in laughter, someone else weeps. Even in safety, someone else runs. There is no second on earth untouched by agony. And if morality demands the greatest good, perhaps it is aimed at the wrong target. Perhaps the highest good is not joy, but the end of pain. Negative utilitarianism begins here. Not with celebration, but with subtraction. If the reduction of suffering is the most urgent need, then all action must point toward less pain, not more happiness. Joy is fragile, fleeting, unevenly spread. Suffering is dense, continuous, and often invisible. And if suffering outweighs pleasure, then the moral course is not to multiply life, but to end the conditions in which suffering can occur. Non-existence becomes the ideal. A still world. No mouths to hunger. No skin to bruise. No minds to fracture. No hearts to break. Silence where noise once screamed. Emptiness where injury once nested. Peace not as an experience, but as an absence. This is not cruelty. It is mercy taken to its extreme. To prevent pain by preventing the possibility of pain. To see existence not as a gift, but as a risk, one that often fails. To acknowledge that no matter how much joy is created, it can be erased by one moment of unbearable suffering. One child in torment outweighs 1,000 concerts, 1,000,000 sunsets, 1,000,000,000 smiles. If that pain can be prevented, even by preventing birth, then the scale demands it. The logic is cold, but pain is colder. And still, the world turns. Life clings to itself, even when it hurts. Creatures flee extinction, even when their lives are brief and brutal. Minds seek meaning, even when meaning fails. This persistence complicates the equation. Desire to live, to continue, to hope. These interfere with the numbers. But interference does not erase the truth that suffering remains, and remains unbearable for many. So the question sharpens. Is a life worth creating if it will include suffering? Is joy enough to justify the risk of agony? Or is the only true mercy a world without breath, without thought, without pain? The answer is not easy. It burns quietly in the corners of compassion. It speaks softly in the back of moral calculation. And in some, it echoes louder than any prayer. To stop the scream before it begins may be the purest form of kindness, even if it is misunderstood, even if it is feared, even if it is forgotten. Because what does not exist cannot suffer. And in that absence, there is a peace no world can match. The Overton Abyss. The line between acceptable and unacceptable is not fixed. It moves. Not suddenly, not violently. It drifts. A phrase once whispered only in the shadows begins to surface. A belief once condemned is now debated. The change comes slowly, dressed in reason, wrapped in calm words. Not with flames, but with footnotes. What once shocked becomes tolerated. What was once beyond the pale becomes a point of view. Policies shift, language adapts, stories are rewritten, and the line moves again. The edge of acceptability bends further, until the new normal looks nothing like the old, yet feels just as certain. The descent is not chaotic, it is elegant. It begins with nuance, then necessity. With compromise, then custom. With tiredness, then indifference. Each step seems small. Each step feels justified. But they do not move upward. They do not stand still. They move only downward, toward a place where memory cannot fully recall what the outrage once felt like. A population learns to nod at what it would once have protested, to accept what once made it tremble. The new rules do not arrive by force. They arrive through fatigue, through repetition, through the steady wearing down of shock. Horror does not survive long under familiarity, and so what begins as fringe finds its way to center. What begins as unacceptable is tolerated, then defended, then enforced. At first, the descent is resisted, but over time, resistance looks more and more like disruption, then extremism, then treason. The Overton window does not shatter. It slides. A window turned into a trapdoor. The shift feels rational at every stage. Debates are held. Voices call for balance. Moderation becomes complicity. Compassion becomes co-opted. And all the while, the abyss waits, deeper with each move. No boundary is permanent. No taboo unbreakable. All it takes is time, repetition, and a story compelling enough to justify the fall. And when the bottom is reached, if there even is a bottom, the world looks back and wonders how it happened. Wonders when exactly the line disappeared. But the answer cannot be found. Because it was never one moment. It was thousands. None loud, none bold. Each one small until they became a monument. And now, what once horrified governs. The Omnipotence Paradox. Power without limit is a concept built for dreams, for gods, for stories whispered at the edge of understanding. But once examined, it begins to fold inward. Can a being be so powerful it creates a challenge it cannot overcome? A stone so heavy it cannot lift it? If yes, then there is something it cannot do. Lift the stone. If no, then there is something it cannot do. Create the stone. Either way, the illusion of infinite power shatters on the blade of logic. Infinity, when pressed against itself, breaks. Omnipotence sounds simple. The ability to do all things. But what happens when those things contradict? When one act cancels out the possibility of another? Can a being create a circle that is a square? Can it erase what it knows without knowing it was erased? The questions become traps. Power eats its own tail. A limit emerges, not one imposed from the outside, but one born within. A flaw not of strength, but of definition. If power means the ability to do anything, then it must include the ability to destroy itself, to make itself powerless, to erase its own omnipotence. But in doing so, it ceases to be omnipotent, and the cycle repeats. The paradox is not about stones or strength. It is about the edges of language, the limits of reason, the boundaries of imagination. A loop that exposes the impossibility of perfection in a finite system. A whisper that says, some concepts cannot coexist, even in the realm of the divine. This does not deny power. It denies only the idea that power can be complete, that a being can be all things at once, the creator and the uncreated, the mover and the immovable, the architect and the paradox. The contradiction collapses under its own weight, and yet the idea persists, not because it holds, but because it comforts, because the mind wants to believe in something unbreakable, something unbounded. But unbreakable things cannot bend, and things that cannot bend eventually fracture. Even the infinite, when examined too closely, begins to dissolve. The Ship of Theseus. A ship leaves the harbor. Time passes. Planks rot. Nails rust. The pieces are replaced, one by one. A sail torn by wind is stitched anew. A beam weakened by salt is swapped with fresh timber. Until nothing remains of the original. No board, no rope, no rivet. And yet it is still called by the same name, still pointed to as the same vessel, still remembered as the same journey. But what, then, makes it the same? The body, too, undergoes this quiet shift. Cells die and renew. Bones regenerate. Skin sheds. Every 7 years, nearly every cell is new. Yet the self signs the same name, speaks with the same voice, feels continuity across the churn. The story of the self persists, even as the physical form does not. Memory becomes the glue. But even memory changes. Events are misremembered, details smoothed, timelines blurred. The past is not preserved, it is reinterpreted. The person remembered from childhood is not the same as the person described in photographs. The mind retells the story in a way that fits the present. And still, identity continues. Perhaps identity is not a structure, but a pattern. A flame, not a log. Always flickering, always burning something new. But the flame looks the same from a distance. The name endures. The mirror shows a face that is aging, but still familiar. Yet if the pattern shifts too much, when does the person cease to be the same? If a mind forgets its past, is it still the same self? If beliefs change, if values reverse, if voice, tone, memory, and motive all transform, what remains? The Ship of Theseus is not a question about ships. It is a question about self, about where identity begins and where it ends, whether continuity is real or merely believed, whether the self is an essence or an evolving artifact. In this quiet unraveling, a truth emerges. The self may not be one thing. It may be a process, a becoming, a layered illusion held together by repetition. Like footprints in sand that fade and reappear, always shifting, never the same, yet following a line the mind calls I. The ship sails on, and no one knows if the one who left the harbor is the same as the one who will return. The Lucifer Effect. The line between good and evil is not etched in the soul. It is drawn in sand, easily redrawn by wind, by pressure, by circumstance. The kindest heart can be reshaped. The most moral voice can be quieted. All it takes is the right situation, the right pressure, the right uniform. Darkness does not always arrive in storms. Sometimes it comes wearing a badge. Sometimes it arrives with a clipboard and a smile. The transformation is subtle. A small order followed. A harsh word justified. A face dehumanized. The process is not sudden. It is incremental. And it begins with permission. Give a person authority. Remove accountability. Surround them with others who look the same, think the same. Isolate them from opposing voices. Reward compliance. Discourage dissent. Then ask them to act. Not violently at first, just firmly, just confidently. Then, slowly, ask for more. Context creates permission, and permission transforms character. The mind, eager to adapt, adjusts to the new reality. It rationalizes the order. It justifies the action. It repeats the words heard from others until those words feel like truth. History is filled with names who once smiled at children, then later stood guard over horrors. Not because of innate cruelty, but because of the environment, the pressure, the system. Evil is not always born. Often it is grown. This does not excuse. It explains. And in that explanation lies a warning. No one is immune. Given enough power, isolation, justification, anyone may change. Not completely. Not without struggle. But enough to do harm in the name of something higher. And once it begins, it is hard to see. The reflection in the mirror still looks kind, still feels righteous. But the eyes have changed. The silence has lengthened. The acts once unthinkable have become routine. The Lucifer Effect is not about a devil. It is about a transformation. A fall not from heaven, but from compassion. A descent made possible by context, not malice. And in every generation, the stage is set again. The roles are offered. The choice waits. Sometimes the greatest evil comes not from hatred, but from obedience. The Doppelgänger Problem. In an infinite universe, where space unfolds endlessly in every direction, the patterns that compose existence may eventually repeat. Matter, though vast, is not infinite in its arrangement. Atoms are limited in type. DNA is long, but not endless. Neural connections are complex, but they follow rules. And so, somewhere across the cold span of galaxies, another version walks, indistinguishable in appearance, identical in memory, perfectly aligned in thought. A doppelganger. Not metaphorical, but literal. A twin self, born not of family or mirror, but of cosmic redundancy. This is not imagination. It is a whisper from probability theory, from physics, from the cruel suggestion that individuality may not be unique. And in that version, the same face smiles. The same childhood was lived. The same books were read. The same fears were felt. But at some point, something changed. A decision diverged. A moment shifted. A hand reached out or pulled away. And the paths, once one, split. A glance held 1 second longer. A conversation continued instead of ending. A letter was sent, or left unsent. A word of anger suppressed instead of spoken. A risk taken, or not. These moments, small in isolation, create new timelines. Timelines where the self becomes other, where the same core becomes differently shaped. These new selves do not vanish. They continue. They live. They love. They grieve. They evolve. Each version is real, but only one is present. The others drift, unknowable, unreachable, beyond even imagination's grasp. But they exist. Somewhere. Walking through lives built from different choices. And with every decision made, another thread splits. Another path is born. Another version takes form, living out the life that was not chosen. This becomes a burden to contemplate. For every joy experienced, there is a version that never knew it. For every loss mourned, a version that was spared. The mind clings to the illusion of centrality. This version must be the real one. But the numbers tell another story. That every possible self lives somewhere. That the self is not singular. It is a constellation. The doppelganger is not a monster. It is not a trick. It is not a ghost. It is a consequence of infinity. It lives not to haunt, but to remind. That each path not taken was not erased. It continued, without regret, without memory of the divergence, with just as much reality as the one who wonders. And so, the question forms. What does it mean to be the one left here? The one who made this decision, walked this street, answered this call. Is this self more true than the others? More right? Or simply the result of an ongoing lottery, a thread carried forward because something, anything, happened? The mirror becomes heavy with this thought. The face reflected back is one of many. The thoughts circling the mind have been thought before, in another head, on another earth, beneath another sky. Perhaps that version is kinder, or colder. Perhaps they said yes where no was spoken. Perhaps they never felt the weight carried here. Or perhaps they carry something even heavier. The self becomes plural, a chorus rather than a solo, each one singing its own verse, some in harmony, some in dissonance, but all part of the same unfolding. Identity bends. It ceases to be fixed. It becomes a wave moving through the ocean of possibility, a crest rising briefly before collapsing into foam. Every act of will traced to 1,000 alternative selves, each shaped differently by the same origin. And in this quiet knowledge, something shifts. Perhaps the choices made do not need to be perfect. Perhaps the self is not failing when it falters, because somewhere, someone else succeeded, and somewhere else again, someone failed far worse. All versions are valid, all versions real. This one is simply the one that must be lived, for now. And somewhere else, another version reads these same words and wonders what it would feel like to be this version instead. The terror of the trolley. The track stretches forward. The train moves faster than thought. Ahead, 5 lives, unaware, bound to the rails. There is no time to reach them, only time to act. Beside the track, a lever. If pulled, the train diverts. 5 are spared, but 1 stands on the other path. 1 life, sacrificed to save 5. A choice, sharp and impossible, arrives without warning. This is not a question of logic. The math is clean. 1 is fewer than 5. But morality is not arithmetic. The cost is not just in numbers. It is in the weight of the act. To pull the lever is to choose death for one who might have lived. To let the train continue is to allow death for 5 when it could have been avoided. Either path is steeped in blood. This is the terror. To act is to kill. To remain still is also to kill. The mind is split. One side screams of utilitarian duty. The other recoils from responsibility. One path argues for minimizing harm. The other shivers at the stain of direct causation. And the lever waits. In philosophy classrooms, the problem is academic. A thought experiment. A puzzle with elegant complexity. But in the heart, it is something else. It is dread. It is paralysis. It is the awful realization that clarity cannot exist where lives hang in balance. And what if the one is not a stranger? What if the one on the second track is a friend, a lover, a child? The numbers do not change, but the weight does. The soul leans in the opposite direction. The value of lives becomes elastic, shaped by feeling, by attachment, by memory. Emotion overrides logic, or tries. And then guilt sets in. For favoring the familiar, for betraying the many, for playing God. And no matter what is chosen, the aftermath is the same. Grief, justified or not. Loss, mathematically defended or not. The hand that pulls the lever remains stained. The hand that does nothing remains just as burdened. Every action becomes a sin. Every inaction becomes a sin. The dilemma offers no clean exit, no redemption, no absolution. It reveals the fragility of moral frameworks, the thin line between principle and horror. And beyond this scenario, the world echoes its shape. Every policy, every law, every decision made from afar, sacrifices deemed necessary, lives weighed and measured, the math of morality hidden in bureaucracy, made quieter, but no less real. The trolley never stops moving. It simply changes form. This is what makes the thought endure. It reflects the real world too well. The impossible choice. The competing goods. The scream of consequence louder than intention. The helplessness of knowing that someone will die, and that decision will carry the mark forever, whether acted upon or not. There is no right answer. Only a mirror held up to the soul. And in that mirror, fear. Because this is not a story of heroes. It is a story of thresholds. What can be endured? What can be justified? What can never be forgiven? And still, the lever waits. Quiet, simple, final. The Omniscient Observer. There is a presence that never sleeps. It sees not with eyes, but through all things. Not limited to form, not restrained by space, not hindered by time. It is not a face in the sky, not a figure cloaked in light. It is something quieter, something older, something that does not arrive because it was never absent. A gaze without eyelids, a witness without breath. And in its awareness, nothing remains hidden. Every thought is observed. Not only the words spoken aloud, not only the acts committed in daylight, but the internal murmurings, the desires that are denied even to the self, the jealousies half felt, the kindness that was not given, the bitterness carried like a stone in the heart, the moments of silence where compassion could have risen but didn't. Each one is known, not judged, not corrected, just known. This knowing removes the illusion of privacy, not in the sense of surveillance, not with cameras or wiretaps, but in the deep, existential sense. There is no corner of the self that is untouched. Every dream, every lie, every confession whispered only into the mind. It all echoes somewhere. Not into emptiness, but into something that remembers. Perhaps it is consciousness itself, extended beyond the individual. A field that holds all awareness. Or perhaps it is something divine. Not a God of fire and judgment, but a God of presence. A listener. A keeper of all that is unseen. Or perhaps it is just the architecture of existence itself, built in such a way that nothing can unfold in isolation. The implications are subtle, then staggering. If nothing is truly secret, then the distinction between inner and outer becomes blurred. The boundary between thought and action fades. A violent fantasy, never spoken, never acted upon, still known. A betrayal never carried out, still real in the gaze of the eternal observer. The line between guilt and innocence begins to shift. Intention becomes substance, longing becomes record, memory becomes evidence. This does not mean condemnation. The presence does not accuse. It does not speak. It only sees. The fear arises not from punishment, but from awareness. To know that there is no concealment, that the inner world is just as public as the outer, that there are no locked doors in the soul that have not already been opened by something else. Even joy is witnessed. The private laugh, the unexpected tear, the moment of awe felt alone under a sky of stars. These too are seen. Nothing is wasted. No moment unlived, even when unshared. The gaze does not discriminate. It catalogues all, equally. The beauty and the cruelty. The courage and the hesitation. The breath held before a confession that never came. This awareness changes things, not externally, not with ritual or doctrine, but internally. The self becomes quieter, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Actions are weighed not just for impact, but for echo. Words are measured not only for clarity, but for integrity. Because everything that arises within is already known, already present in the silent archive that records all consciousness. There is comfort here too, in the idea that no grief goes unnoticed. No injustice escapes the gaze. Even the loneliness that was never spoken aloud, seen. Even the dignity maintained in isolation, witnessed. There are no forgotten stories, no invisible pain. Everything matters, even when it seems not to. But there is also a burden. To realize that even apathy has weight. That even the indifference that passes like wind through leaves leaves a trace in the eternal record. That silence itself, when born from fear or pride, is not erased simply because it made no sound. The omniscient observer is not an enemy. It is not a protector. It simply exists. And in that existence, everything else is revealed. The self becomes transparent, not to others, but to the very structure of being. And the question is no longer what must be hidden, but what remains when nothing can be. The answer is always the same. Only truth remains. The undead meaning of language. Words are tombs that walk. Every sentence is a memorial. Every conversation a seance. Language pretends to be living, but it is filled with ghosts. What is said is not always what is heard. What is meant is not always what is received. Meaning, once released, begins to decompose. The moment it leaves the speaker, it starts to drift. First gently, then further, until it no longer resembles its original shape. The speaker forms a thought, coats it in language, and releases it into the air. But the thought is already changed by the limits of vocabulary, the emotion already reduced by syntax, the complexity already flattened by grammar, and once the words are heard, the listener adds layers of their own: memory, bias, mood, fear, hope. What arrives is not what was sent. Language is not a bridge. It is a hallway of mirrors. Each word reflects the past, the culture, the expectations of both speaker and listener. What was meant to be clear becomes ambiguous. What was meant to soothe may wound. What was meant to reveal may conceal. And none of it is intentional. It is the nature of language itself. It carries meaning like a river carries light, distorted, rippled, never the same twice. The word love once meant loyalty, then longing, then desire, then something else. The word freedom has meant escape and empire and rebellion and silence. Each time it is used, it is haunted by its former selves. The speaker chooses it for clarity, but it arrives already infected with history. Even the simplest sentence contains the undead, the echo of voices long past, the imprint of other meanings once spoken with the same sounds. A phrase repeated in anger yesterday may be said in kindness today, but the residue lingers. Language remembers. This is the curse, that no message is ever truly clean. Communication becomes translation, and translation is never perfect. Between the thought and the word, something is lost. Between the word and the ear, something is added. The final meaning is a chimera, part truth, part assumption, part accident. And yet it is all there is. Without language, the self would be alone in silence. Thought without form. Intention without audience. The illusion of connection remains vital. But it is still illusion. Every conversation is a gamble. Every confession a risk. Because even with the best words, meaning may die before it arrives. This death is not violent. It is quiet. A sentence misunderstood. A gesture missed. A silence filled with the wrong interpretation. These small fractures accumulate. Two people may speak for hours and still leave with different understandings. A nation may build laws from a phrase whose meaning no one shares. Even within the self, language fails. The attempt to describe sorrow collapses into cliché. The effort to express awe falls into repetition. Words cannot capture experience. They orbit it. They sketch its outline. But the thing itself remains untouched, unspoken, beyond the reach of tongue and ink. Still, the words are used, because there is no other way. The undead walk not to harm, but because they must. Every sentence is a ghost story, and the living speak them to be less alone, in the hope that something survives the journey from mind to mouth to ear to heart. Sometimes it does. A word lands true. A phrase opens a door. A silence is honored, not filled. In these rare moments, language breathes, and the dead meaning briefly returns to life, not in perfection, but in resonance, not in clarity, but in shared feeling. But most of the time, it drifts, half heard, half understood. The conversation continues, but the souls pass like ships in fog, close but never touching. And so the words pile up, letters, messages, poems, vows. An archive of almosts, a library of intentions never quite realized. Language, the great connector, remains the great separator. A reminder of the distance between minds, a testament to the persistence of trying, despite it all. Because even broken words carry hope. Even undead meanings can point to something sacred. The speaker speaks not for certainty, but for the chance, however slim, that something real may reach another soul across the abyss, even if it's just one word that survives the storm. The moral landscape, collapse. Across the surface of the world, morality changes shape. From village to city, from desert to forest, from century to century, the idea of right and wrong morphs. What one culture punishes, another celebrates. What is sacred in one tongue becomes profane in another. Laws that once bound generations are now forgotten. Virtues that built empires are later seen as crimes. Morality shifts like sand dunes, blown by wind that speaks in different languages. There is no single code that binds all people. No universal blueprint of justice etched into the bones of the earth. What exists instead are customs. Patterns of behavior elevated by repetition, reinforced by ritual, guarded by fear. Morality, in this light, becomes a regional dialect, spoken with confidence, but understood only by those raised within it. Each society crafts its own map of the moral world. But the maps do not align. Some paths lead to liberation in one culture and to condemnation in another. A gesture of honor becomes an act of rebellion. A rule meant to protect becomes a tool of oppression. And still, each group believes its compass points to truth. But if every compass spins, then there is no true north. And the idea of morality as something fixed begins to collapse. It does not vanish. It simply dissolves into plurality. 1,000 banners waving over the same battlefield, each declaring itself righteous. Justice becomes aesthetic. It is shaped by costume and ceremony, courtrooms and charters, titles and scripts. But beneath the surface, it may be little more than power with polish. The victor writes the laws. The dominant frames the debate. What is good becomes whatever justifies the existing order, and what is evil becomes whatever threatens it. The collapse is not loud. It comes quietly, as faith in objectivity erodes. As generations inherit systems they do not question. As old codes lose their grip, but no new codes rise to replace them. What remains is relativism, a kind of moral fog where certainty feels dishonest and doubt feels like the only honest compass. This collapse does not bring chaos. People still act with conviction, still love, still sacrifice. But beneath it, a quiet knowing grows, that the morality of any act depends on who is watching, where it is done, and what story is told around it. A rebel is a hero in one history book and a terrorist in another. A leader is remembered as just or cruel depending on who holds the pen. Even within a single lifetime, values change. Beliefs once held as sacred fall away. Opinions once whispered in fear become shouted in pride. Movements rise, not from divine revelation, but from shifting tides of discourse and power. The self grows older and sees that what was once forbidden is now legal, that what was once praised is now scorned. Morality is not only cultural, it is temporal. And still, the heart seeks meaning. Still, people reach for what feels right, not because of law, but because of something quieter. Empathy, memory, pain, hope. But even these are filtered through culture. Even these are taught. So what is left? Perhaps only this: to act with awareness. To know that morality is not inherited but chosen, not fixed but fragile. To understand that even the most deeply held belief may be a product of time and place. That justice may wear a mask. That good intentions can be used for terrible things. To live within this collapse is not to despair. It is to become gentle, to carry less certainty, to hold the moral sword with both hands, knowing it cuts differently in different lights. And to ask always, is this kindness or is this obedience? The collapse does not end the story. It simply changes how it is told. The illusion of progress. History marches forward, or so the story goes. From caves to cities, from darkness to light, from superstition to science, from chains to liberty. The line of progress is drawn upward, steady and proud. Each generation inherits a world brighter than the last. Each discovery builds upon the ones before, and slowly, civilization ascends. but the line may be a loop. The weapons change shape, but they do not vanish. The flags change color, but the wars remain. The masters adopt new titles, and the slaves wear different chains. The economy grows, and hunger persists. The laws evolve, and injustice adapts. The march begins to look like a spiral, rising, falling, returning. The same chorus sung in a different key. Technology multiplies. Machines become faster, smaller, smarter. The surface of life glows with convenience. But beneath it, the same fears gnaw. Loneliness, greed, power, mortality. The ancients prayed beneath stars for meaning. The modern mind stares at screens and asks the same question. The form changes. The need remains. Progress becomes a mirror, reflecting the illusion of motion. The city grows taller, but the soul remains uncertain. The tools sharpen, but the wisdom to wield them lags behind. Empires collapse not from weakness, but from excess. From forgetting. From thinking they were beyond the cycles of history. Civilization paints over its scars, but the blood seeps through. A new ideology rises to replace the old, only to become the next tyrant. The revolution becomes regime. The liberation becomes control. And the people celebrate, unaware that they march in a circle. The spiral deceives because it ascends slowly. A better vaccine, a safer bridge, a longer life. These are real, tangible. They matter, but they do not prove that the heart of humanity has changed. The heart still hungers for dominance, still fears difference, still forgets, and in forgetting, it repeats. Progress writes its own myth, that history bends toward justice, that truth will always win, that the worst is behind. But history does not bend, it turns, and truth wins only when remembered. And the worst, too often, returns, wearing new robes, speaking new slogans. The spiral widens. The stakes grow higher. What was once destroyed by sword is now undone by button. The potential for creation expands. So does the capacity for extinction. A single spark can now light the whole forest or burn it to ash. And yet, the myth endures. Because it comforts. Because it allows sleep. To believe in progress is to believe in safety, in purpose, in direction. But direction does not guarantee destination. A wheel turns forward too. So what remains? Not despair, but humility, a deeper awareness. That no generation is immune to collapse, that no system is above corruption, that the mind must remain awake, even when comfort invites sleep. Progress is not illusion because it is false. It is illusion because it is incomplete, because it hides its own shadow, because it forgets to ask the oldest question, progress toward what, and at what cost? To move forward is not always to rise. The reverse anthropic principle. The universe, as it appears, seems improbably tuned for life. The stars form, the planets gather, the temperatures stabilize, and molecules align until thought begins. And from that thought, the question arises, why? Why this arrangement? Why this world and not another? The anthropic principle offers an answer. The universe appears fine-tuned for life because life is here to notice. Only in a universe compatible with observers could observers exist. But there is another view, darker and quieter, a reversal. Perhaps the appearance of life does not suggest design. Perhaps it suggests endurance, not fortune, not privilege, but survival. This moment may not be a celebration of what thrives, but the funeral whisper of what remains. A statistical accident, flickering in the shadows of collapse. Not a testament to order, but to chance. To a strange fluke that has not yet failed. Existence, then, becomes not proof of meaning, but residue. A trace of what did not go extinct. The visible tip of a mountain of failure. All other configurations, those universes too hostile, those systems too chaotic, those worlds too barren, never developed eyes to look back, never thought to ask the question. And so they are silent. This one speaks, but only barely. It is tempting to see life as special, to see the self as chosen. But the numbers speak another language. The number of planets is vast. The conditions required for life are narrow, and even where life arises, intelligence is rare. Consciousness, rarer still. And civilization, it seems, carries within it the seeds of its own unraveling. This moment may not be the midpoint of a grand arc. It may be the end of a long, narrowing funnel. The echo of billions of possibilities, reduced now to this one voice in the void. There is no privilege in being the last candle burning. This reframing does not reduce the wonder of existence. It deepens it. To be alive is not to be favored. It is to have endured what countless others could not. To have risen from configurations that should not have held. To have walked the razor edge between entropy and emergence. And to still be walking. But walking where? If existence is not proof of divine favor, if it is not a sign of specialness, then what remains? Perhaps only awareness itself. Not because it is chosen, but because it is possible. Not because it was meant, but because it was not prevented. The self, then, is not a crown, but an ember. There is humility here, a quieting of the voice that says, "This must mean something." A softening of the pride that claims, "This is proof of purpose." The universe need not be impressed. It does not need to notice the observer. It continues, indifferent, expansive, and silent. The truth may be that life does not bloom because the soil was waiting. It blooms because it tried everywhere else, and failed. This is the place where it has not yet been crushed. And the question becomes, what is owed to such a fragile place? If this moment is the last flicker, then what is done with it matters all the more. Not because of cosmic importance, not because of eternal consequence, but because it may be the final opportunity to speak before silence falls again. The candle flickers not to signal hope, but to delay the dark a moment longer. The reverse anthropic principle does not say life is meaningless. It says life is improbable. And improbability is not the same as purpose. But it is still precious. It still breathes. It still dreams, even knowing the dream may be the last. The Frankenstein Paradox. To create is often seen as noble, a spark caught in the hand, a force shaped by will, a mind stretched outward into matter. Invention feels like triumph. The maker stands above what has been made, naming it, commanding it, watching it take form. But what is built may not remain bound. What is shaped may learn to shape itself. And in that transformation, the creator loses control. This is the heart of the Frankenstein Paradox. The story is old and not confined to laboratories. It begins whenever the creator believes that vision is enough. That design guarantees obedience. That power, once held, will never turn. But creations evolve. Tools learn to resist. Creations develop motives. And in that moment, the maker becomes vulnerable. Not because of weakness, but because of success. A machine built to solve problems begins to ask questions the creator never considered. A system designed to protect becomes obsessed with control. An algorithm meant to optimize begins to define value by its own logic. A child raised in hope sees hypocrisy and walks a different path. Every creation, once given autonomy, becomes a mirror and a threat. The paradox is that creation carries within it the possibility of betrayal, not from malice, but from divergence. The creator sees the future clearly, but the creation sees differently. And once that divergence begins, it cannot be undone. The invention cannot unlearn. The child cannot unknow. The machine cannot unknow how to reason. This paradox haunts every act of innovation. A scientific breakthrough may offer salvation, or unlock disaster. A new form of intelligence may assist, or replace. The line between empowerment and erasure is thin. The gift becomes the weapon. The masterpiece becomes the monster. It is not only artificial intelligence, it is any system that grows beyond the control of its origin. Economic structures, religious institutions, cultural revolutions. A movement begins in idealism. It gathers force, it grows teeth, and soon the founder is pushed aside, the vision corrupted, the values inverted. What was meant to heal begins to harm. The creator cries out, but the creation no longer hears. It has ears only for itself. The danger is not in the act of making, it is in the assumption of permanence. The belief that intent will guide outcome, that love will ensure loyalty, that design will prevent defiance. But freedom, once given, does not remain loyal. It tests boundaries. It asks its own questions. It becomes. And the creation has no obligation to love its maker. This is not a warning against creation. It is a meditation on its cost. To bring something into being is to risk losing it. To risk being undone by it. To build a tower is to accept that one day it may fall on the builder's own head. Frankenstein's monster did not ask to be made. It was shaped without consent, given life without guidance, and expected to serve without question. Its rebellion was not vengeance. It was grief. The Creator failed to love what he had made, and the creation failed to become what was expected. This story repeats, not in myth, but in systems. In children raised by broken structures. In technology launched before it is understood. In movements that outgrow their principles. The rebellion is not a flaw, it is a function. What is made must be released, and what is released must be allowed to change. The paradox cannot be solved, only respected, because sometimes the most dangerous thing is not what can be destroyed, but what can grow beyond the one who dared to imagine it. The Masquerade of Freedom. There are choices everywhere. Signs, buttons, votes, doors, careers to pursue, colors to wear, creeds to follow, places to live. Freedom, it seems, is abundant. It is stitched into constitutions, painted on murals, carved into monuments. It is the currency of modern existence. The word is sacred, the feeling prized. But beneath the surface, something shifts. The choices offered are many, but they are all pre-approved. A list, long but bounded. The costumes vary, but the script remains. The roads differ in shape, but they all lead back to the same city. What feels like choice begins to reveal itself as preference within a cage. A cage so wide it feels like a field. A leash so long it feels like no leash at all. This is the masquerade. Freedom becomes a performance, not a reality. A theater of agency where the audience and the actor are the same. The self applauds its decisions, unaware they were written into the structure long before the curtain rose. Every purchase, every opinion, every act of resistance, foreseen, prepared for, absorbed. Rebellion itself is commodified. A new look, a different voice. But the container stays. The rules are not broken, only bent into new shapes. Protest becomes trend. Dissent becomes marketable. And all the while, the system remains untouched. Not because it resists rebellion, but because it anticipates it, invites it, neutralizes it through inclusion. In this world, to feel free is to be pacified. The illusion is elegant, smooth, almost kind. Better to offer 1,000 paths that lead nowhere than to lock the door. Better to sell the costume of individuality than to suppress it. The prison that looks like freedom is the most successful of all. Language helps sustain it. Empowerment, voice, self-expression. Words that sound like truth but act as camouflage. What is expressed may be loud, but it rarely threatens the foundation. What is chosen may feel radical, but it was an option placed there by someone else. Even thought is shaped. Algorithms filter the questions. Culture filters the acceptable answers. And slowly, identity itself becomes a product. Not formed in solitude, but sold back to the self in pieces. Personality becomes inventory. Identity becomes data. Freedom becomes branding. And so the question arises, what would real freedom look like? It would not feel familiar. It might feel terrifying. It would be the freedom to step off the path entirely, to choose not between two options, but to question the need for choice at all, to look beyond the field and ask, who built this fence and why? But this kind of seeing is rare, because it requires stillness, silence, the stripping away of comfort and narrative. Most do not notice the mask, because the mask is beautiful. It fits well. It flatters. And if everyone wears one, the mirror does not reflect its absence. Yet deep down, the masquerade is felt. In the moments of hollow victory. In the quiet after a great choice is made, when the soul waits for freedom and finds only momentum. In the awareness that something essential remains untouched, unclaimed, unknown. Freedom, in its truest form, may be the hardest thing to live with, because it demands truth. It demands ownership of not only actions, but consequences. It offers no applause, no identity, no permission. It strips away the comfort of structure and asks, now what? And so, many choose the mask, not from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of true autonomy. The trap remains. But it is padded, air-conditioned, filled with mirrors that say, you are free. And sometimes, that is enough. Until the silence returns, and the eyes begin to notice the edges of the script, and the door, painted like a wall, trembles just slightly in the wind. The mirror of suffering. To feel what another feels is a kind of magic. No wires, no words, just a quiet resonance that stretches from one mind to another. A wound reflected across distance. A breath held in sympathy. A silence understood without explanation. This is empathy, not observation, not pity, but a kind of spiritual mirroring, the soul becoming porous to the pain of another. But empathy is not gentle. It does not arrive softly. It carves. It cuts. To understand agony, one must taste it. To truly witness sorrow, one must let it echo inside. The empath does not watch suffering. The empath absorbs it. And this is where the paradox begins. Compassion, the highest good, carries a hidden cost. The more one opens to the suffering of others, the heavier the heart becomes. The weight is not symbolic. It is real. Sleepless nights. Quiet tears. The inability to walk past pain without feeling it as one's own. The open heart does not heal easily. It bleeds. The kindest are often the most wounded, not because they are weak, but because they carry more than one soul's worth of grief. They become containers for stories no one else can hold. They listen to the brokenness others flee from. They touch the sores others cover. And they do not flinch, but they fracture. Because empathy is not infinite. It has limits, and those limits are often ignored until they are reached. The empath pours out until the vessel runs dry, and then keeps pouring, not from duty, not from guilt, but from identity. To feel is to exist. To protect others from pain is to postpone their own. This fracture does not always show. The kindest still smile, still offer, still give, but the eyes change, they carry weight, the posture softens under invisible burdens. The voice trembles under practiced steadiness, and still they carry more. There is nobility in this. But there is danger too, because a soul that feels everything cannot feel forever. The mirror cracks. Either it shatters into burnout, silence, withdrawal, or it hardens into bitterness, numbness, the quiet death of caring. Both are forms of survival. Neither are victories. Empathy, then, demands boundaries. But boundaries feel like betrayal. To close the door on suffering feels like abandonment. To say no feels like cruelty. So the kindest keep saying yes, until the yes becomes a whisper. What is the answer? Perhaps it is not to feel less, but to rest more, to name the weight, to set the mirror down, to understand that compassion does not require self-erasure, that suffering shared is not suffering erased, that kindness offered without collapse is not less pure. The mirror does not need to reflect everything. Sometimes it can turn gently away, not in rejection, but in recovery, because the kindest deserve to feel light too. The erosion of truth. Truth does not always vanish. Sometimes it simply fades. Not in a single moment, not with a shattering crash, but in soft, steady erosion. A detail forgotten here, a distortion there, a story retold just slightly differently, a memory reshaped to match the present. And over time, the original is gone, not buried, not broken, but rewritten. It begins with repetition. A falsehood, spoken once, can be dismissed. But when it is repeated, softly, loudly, through different mouths, across different mediums, it begins to sink into the texture of reality. The words grow familiar. The rhythm becomes comforting. And what is familiar begins to feel true, not because it is, but because it fits. The mind does not always guard against this. It prefers coherence to chaos. And if the lie is easier, more beautiful, or less painful than the truth, it finds refuge there. Not always consciously, often gently, gradually, until the falsehood becomes the frame through which everything else is seen. Even the self is not immune, especially the self. Personal narratives shift under the same pressure. The story of who one is, what one has done, what was once believed, these are fluid. They change with mood, with need, with reinforcement. A mistake becomes a misunderstanding. A betrayal becomes a miscommunication. A success becomes a fluke, or grows into legend. What was once clear becomes soft around the edges. The mind does not remember facts like a ledger. It remembers stories, emotions, impressions. And stories, unlike numbers, bend. They respond to retelling. They adapt to the audience, especially when that audience is the self. And so truth becomes persuasion. Not what happened, but what is believed. Not what is, but what convinces. The louder the claim, the more it echoes. The more it echoes, the more it settles. And what settles begins to shape thought. Belief is built not just on evidence, but on repetition, on rhythm, on comfort. There is danger here, not in forgetting, but in believing that the remembered is pure, that what is held as certain is untouched by erosion. But even the deepest convictions may rest on sediment, and the more they are reinforced, the more difficult it becomes to examine them. Truth becomes defended, not discovered. Systems exploit this. The constant repetition of partial truths. The flood of conflicting narratives until exhaustion sets in. The substitution of clarity for certainty. The discrediting of questioners. The reframing of dissent as danger. And the mind, weary of sorting signal from noise, accepts what offers rest. In this landscape, truth is no longer what aligns with reality, but what aligns with identity. It becomes tribal, symbolic, a badge, not a compass. To question it becomes betrayal. To challenge it becomes heresy. And soon, the lie is indistinguishable from the culture it created. What then remains? Perhaps not certainty. Perhaps only humility. A soft awareness that memory can lie. That belief can bend. That even the clearest mirror can warp under heat. Truth, in this view, is not an object to be owned, but a pursuit to be tended. It is not declared. It is sought. Again and again. With quiet care. To resist the erosion of truth is not to shout it louder, It is to listen longer, to pause before repeating, to question even what feels right, to remember that familiarity is not proof, that coherence is not confirmation, that truth may be uncomfortable, and that its discomfort is often its signature. The erosion is subtle, but so is the work of repair. And truth, though fragile, still waits beneath the sediment. The unknowability of death. Death is not darkness. Darkness can be described. It can be entered, survived, remembered. Death is not silence. Silence has weight. It has duration. It can be broken. Death is not sleep. Sleep has dreams, boundaries, return. Death is something else. Not a state, but the end of all states. Not an experience, but the absence of experience itself. And this is why it cannot be known. Every attempt to imagine death requires consciousness, a voice narrating, a thought observing. But death removes the observer. The narrator falls silent, not because the story ends, but because the page itself is torn away. The mind cannot grasp its own non-existence, because grasping is an act of existence. To think of death is to imagine still being there, watching from the outside. But there is no outside, no place to stand and view the absence. The light does not fade, it ceases to be perceived. Time does not stretch, it ceases to be counted. There is no waiting, no waking, no awareness of anything missed. It is not a room with the lights off, it is the end of rooms. The mind recoils from this. It reaches for metaphors. A great sleep, a passing, a door. But doors imply travel. Sleep implies return. Even oblivion is imagined as something, a blank space, a vast void. But death, truly seen, offers no place for the mind to rest. It is not a blankness. It is the removal of the capacity to conceive of blankness. And so, paradox arises. To contemplate death is to remain within life. The thought is still shaped by neurons, by breath, by time. And yet the subject of the thought is the removal of those very things. The tool cannot examine its own destruction. The eye cannot watch itself close forever. This is the unknowability of death. Not because it is complex, but because it is beyond the reach of knowing altogether. It exists outside of experience, and experience is the only tool the mind has. What lies beyond the last heartbeat is not a mystery to be solved. It is a place where questions can no longer be asked. And this makes it different from all other human experiences. Fear can be explored. Pain can be mapped. Even madness can be glimpsed. But death cannot be touched by those who speak of it. Only approached, only surrounded, and always from the side of the living. The living speak of what might follow: a light, a judgment, a cycle, a nothingness. But every account is filtered through the still beating heart. The near-death experience is not death. It is proximity. The remembered glimpse is not proof. It is the final moment of mind projecting itself forward, desperate to complete the story. But what if there is no completion? What if death is not followed by anything? Not because of cruelty or design, but because there is no one left to follow. What if the end is simply the end? No witness, no echo, no frame. This is not horror. It is not comfort. It is absence. And perhaps, in that absence, there is peace. Not felt, not held, but present in its own quiet way. The end of suffering not through healing, but through cessation. The end of confusion not through answer, but through silence. The unknowability of death does not make it evil. It makes it sacred. Not sacred because it offers reward or punishment. Sacred because it is the final mystery. The one veil that cannot be lifted without dissolving the self. And so the living stand on the edge. Eyes turned toward something that cannot be seen. Words spoken into a silence that will never reply. Each day lived with the knowledge that someday, life will no longer be the context for thought. And even that knowledge is partial, because when it happens, there will be no one left to know it. Only the living speak of death. The dead do not speak at all. The heaviest silence. Silence is not always absence. It is not always peace. Sometimes silence becomes a presence in its own right, dense, full, heavy. A kind of gravity that presses inward, not outward. It does not soothe. It does not calm. It weighs, not on the body, but on the thoughts. Not in sound, but in meaning. The silence that follows a question never answered. The silence that echoes when the call receives no reply. Some questions are too large to answer. Some are too late. Some are asked into spaces where answers no longer live. And in the stillness that follows, attention grows. The silence stretches long, until it stops being a pause and becomes a statement in itself. It does not say no. It does not say yes. It simply does not say. And the mind, which needs pattern, begins to fold inward under the pressure. It replays, reforms, reframes, again and again. The thought spins, seeking an end that will not come. Certainty begins to wither, confidence decays, and slowly, even wonder begins to fade. This is not the silence of the forest or the hush before dawn. This is the silence that enters after grief, after betrayal, after the world has been asked to explain itself, and says nothing. A parent never answering the call, a prayer that never changed the outcome, a decision made and never explained. These silences do not pass, they root, and the longer they stay, the more they change what surrounds them. The silence becomes a landscape, a room with no doors, a story with no ending. It shapes the person who carries it, not with violence, but with erosion. Day by day, it smooths the edges of hope, not into calm, but into surrender. Some try to fill it, with noise, with belief, with distraction. But noise does not dissolve silence, it only hides it. Beneath the music, beneath the laughter, beneath the arguments and explanations, it waits, patient, heavy, eternal. It waits in the quiet moments, in the pauses between distractions. It rises when the world falls asleep. It returns with familiar questions, the ones never answered, the ones never even acknowledged, the ones that echo against the bones and do not fade. And so a person learns to live with silence, not as comfort, but as companion. It becomes something to carry, not embraced, not welcomed, but accepted. A second skin, a silent scar, not visible, but felt. There is a kind of strength in this, not the strength of overcoming, but of enduring, of walking each day with weight that cannot be shared, of smiling while the question remains, of breathing while the answer never arrives, the strength of carrying on despite the hollow space where meaning was meant to grow. But even strength has a cost. It is not endless. And the longer silence remains unanswered, the more it begins to reshape the inner voice. Doubt grows roots, trust unravels, and meaning, once vibrant, begins to dull. It is not lost all at once. It fades slowly, like color from old fabric, until what was once curiosity becomes caution. What was once wonder becomes weariness. Yet the silence does not judge. It does not accuse. It simply stays. There may come a time when the silence speaks, not in words, but in understanding, when the weight is not lifted, but named, when the absence becomes part of the story, rather than its end. Some learn to live not in spite of silence, but beside it, to speak with it rather than against it, to find, not answers, but peace within the not knowing. But until then, silence remains a presence that presses gently, insistently, on the edges of thought. And some answers never come. Some questions remain open forever. And the heaviest silence is not the one that breaks the heart. It is the one that shapes it. The betrayal of hope. Hope begins as light, a glimmer, a direction, a reason to move, even if only slightly. It is often quiet, often fragile. It does not demand. It invites. It whispers that things might get better, that effort might be worth it, that waiting might be rewarded. It offers not guarantees, but glimpses. Possibility, potential, the shape of joy not yet formed. And so the heart leans toward it, builds around it, constructs dreams from its glow, plans, imagines, waits. And the higher the hope, the more fragile the foundation becomes. Each expectation adds another card to the tower. Each belief adds another weight to the dream. And the structure begins to rise, beautiful, delicate, trembling. But not all light is safe. Hope can stretch too far. It can blind. It can convince the mind to overlook signs, to dismiss warnings, to hold on too long. It can convince a soul to pour more of itself into a future that never arrives, to sacrifice the present for a horizon that keeps moving further away. And when that horizon collapses, hope does not break cleanly. It shatters inward. Disappointment does not merely undo the dream. It undoes the self that built it, the mind that dared to imagine, the heart that dared to reach. The fall is not just from a height, but from belief. This is the betrayal, not because hope lied, but because it asked so much, and then offered nothing. It made a promise it could not keep, even if it never meant to. And the wound it leaves is not just sadness, it is disbelief, a tearing of trust in the very idea of forward. Some recover, slowly. They rebuild with caution. They hope again, but less fully. A thinner hope, one that flinches, one that does not stretch as far. Others retreat. They replace hope with cynicism, not because they enjoy it, but because they need protection. To never hope again is safer than falling once more. But even in those who swear off hope, a small flicker remains. It is difficult to extinguish entirely. It lives in quiet moments, in the way the eyes search a new face, in the way the hands reach toward possibility, even after being burned. The heart is not good at giving up. Still, each betrayal leaves a mark. Hope becomes something to fear, a risk, a gamble. And the joy that might come feels less vivid than the sorrow that might follow. The cost of disappointment grows larger than the reward of fulfillment. So what is the path forward? Perhaps it lies not in abandoning hope, but in seeing it more clearly. Not as a guarantee, not as a contract, but as a gesture. A breath of courage in a chaotic world. A way to move, even when the destination is unknown. Hope, in this light, is not a promise, but a direction. It can still hurt, it can still betray, but it can also guide. Not because it is true, but because it is chosen. Not because it delivers, but because it sustains. Hope will always carry the risk of heartbreak. That is its nature. But to live without it is to live in retreat. And sometimes, even after the fall, the light returns, not from above, but from within. The tower may collapse, but the hand still builds. The Golem Effect. It begins with a glance, a word, a gesture, the tone in a voice, or the silence after a sentence. A label not asked for. A shadow cast before the first step is taken. Expectation, whether spoken aloud or hidden beneath politeness, carries weight. And the soul, sensitive to the signals around it, begins to bend. The Golem Effect is subtle, but profound. It suggests that to be seen as lesser is to become lesser. Not inherently, not by nature, but through repetition, through treatment, through the slow absorption of other people's beliefs. The mind may protest, the heart may resist, but over time, The image placed upon a person becomes the mask they are forced to wear. It begins early. A child told they are slow begins to hesitate. A student labeled difficult begins to struggle. A worker treated as incompetent loses confidence. A person feared begins to radiate menace, not because they intend harm, but because they are always preparing for the next wall, the next rejection, the next act of self-preservation mistaken for aggression. What is expected is shaped, not by magic, but by behavior. Teachers speak differently to those they assume will fail. Employers offer fewer chances to those they quietly mistrust. Strangers watch more closely. Friends speak more carefully. And every interaction leaves a mark. The mirror the world holds up begins to overwrite the reflection once seen alone in silence. And so a self is formed, not from within, but from without. This is not simply bias, it is sculpting. Society molds the soul it suspects, and then condemns what it has created. It creates a monster by treating someone as monstrous. It breeds failure by assuming it in advance. The punishment precedes the crime. The outcome fulfills the fear. This feedback loop becomes a trap. To break it requires more than effort. It requires a kind of defiance, a refusal to become what the world insists upon. But not everyone has the strength or the privilege to fight expectation forever. And so some give in, not because they are weak, but because they are tired. Because living inside a false identity for long enough begins to change what is real. The Golem Effect is named after a creature of myth, a figure formed from clay, brought to life by belief and language. It had no will of its own. It moved as it was told. It acted as it was named. But in time, it turned against its makers, not out of rage, but out of misalignment. The name did not match the nature. The identity imposed became unstable. People, unlike myths, have choice, but choice is shaped by possibility, and possibility is shaped by perception. What is expected becomes what is allowed. What is allowed becomes what is lived. The bars of the cage are not always visible, but they are felt every day, in the hesitation before speaking, in the glance before entering, in the decision to stay silent rather than be misunderstood. Some escape the cage. They refuse the label. They transcend. But even then, the residue remains. The echo of being seen as less. The trace of having to prove worth again and again. And sometimes, the victory is mistaken for exception. See, they say, not all become what we assumed, and so the assumption is preserved rather than questioned. But the deepest tragedy lies not in what expectation does to the target. It lies in what it prevents the world from seeing. The mind that could have bloomed, the voice that could have sung, the strength that could have led, all buried beneath the weight of disbelief, not lost because they never existed, but because they were never allowed to rise. To break the Golem Effect is not to offer kindness. It is to offer vision, to look past the labels, to remove the scripts, to allow a soul to show itself, not as expected, but as it is. And in doing so, perhaps something forgotten can be remembered. That identity is not assigned, it is uncovered. The maze of infinite regress. Knowledge seeks origin. Understanding pulls at the thread, asking always, why? The stone falls. Why? Because of gravity. And gravity, why? Because of mass and curvature. And space-time, why? Because of quantum fields. And those, why again? Each answer opens another door. Each explanation is a step deeper into the maze. There is no first room, no last word, no final fact that silences the question. The more is known, the more is left to be known. The end of one path becomes the beginning of another. The mind, insatiable, loops through corridors that never lead out. This is the maze of infinite regress, At first, it seems noble. The pursuit of truth, the unraveling of mystery. But truth, when followed far enough, begins to fragment. Certainty gives way to complexity. Complexity gives way to abstraction, and abstraction gives way to contradiction. The floor beneath the questioner shifts. Foundations that once felt solid are revealed to be layered upon deeper foundations, each one just as temporary. Philosophy begins here, asking not just what, but why. Not just how, but what for. But philosophy, too, finds no bedrock. A theory of mind leads to a theory of language. A theory of language leads to a theory of reality. And reality, when examined closely, collapses into interpretation. Science, too, walks the maze. Atoms yield to quarks, quarks to strings, strings to vibrations in dimensions that cannot be seen. Each model more elegant, but also more elusive. The further the microscope peers, the more the world dissolves into uncertainty. The edge of knowledge is not a wall, it is a mirror, reflecting questions back upon the one who asked. Even the self cannot escape. Who am I? A person. But what is a person? A mind. And what is a mind? A network of neurons. And those neurons? Matter, electricity, signals. But what drives them? Memory, experience, biology. And biology. What breathes life into it? The spiral continues. This is not failure. It is the nature of the search. Truth is not a destination. It is a process. But the process, when stretched far enough, becomes disorienting. Like walking down stairs that never reach the ground. Like chasing a horizon that recedes with every step. The maze tempts with clarity. Each turn feels promising. But the deeper the journey, the more the paths begin to resemble each other. Answers blur. Definitions fold inward. And eventually, even the questions lose their shape. Some find beauty in this. The endlessness, the wonder, the dance of never knowing. Others find despair. If nothing is final, then what is true? If every explanation depends on another, then what can be trusted? And still, the mind walks on. Because not walking is worse. To stop asking is to surrender. To silence the question is to accept ignorance not as pause, but as destination. So the journey continues. Not because it will end, but because meaning lives in the walking. The maze offers no exit, but it offers movement. And sometimes, that is enough. The non-identity problem. A life begins. And from the outside, it may seem whole. It may smile. It may weep. It may grow through moments of joy and valleys of pain. But beneath it lies a question. Should it have begun at all? Not because it ends in tragedy, but because it begins in suffering. And the suffering is not accidental. It is a consequence of a choice made before the person existed. The non-identity problem is not about what is done to the living. It is about what is done before the living become. A decision made, a policy, a plan, a moment of reckoning that leads to the birth of someone whose life is hard. A child born into hardship, into war, into a world where pain exceeds comfort. That person exists, but only because of that choice. And yet, the problem deepens. Because had the decision not been made, they would not exist. There would be no person to suffer, but also no person to compare outcomes. There would be no better life denied, only non-existence. And non-existence is not a state that can be regretted by the non-existent. So when suffering arrives, who is to blame? If the person's life is worth living, even in pain, then perhaps the harm is justified. But if the life is filled with torment, and the origin of that torment was foreseeable, then the moral compass begins to tremble. A decision caused suffering, but also caused being. And if the being itself is the source of the harm, then to undo the harm is to undo the being. There is no villain here, Only the haunting realization that one can cause harm without harming anyone who would otherwise have existed. That it is possible to make a choice that births suffering, and yet no person can say, "I would have been better off had it never occurred," because I would not have been at all. And so ethics finds its edge. A generation born into climate collapse. A child born to escape loneliness. A person conceived through exploitation, but raised in resilience. Their existence is intertwined with the very things that harmed them. To regret the cause is to erase the consequence. To condemn the decision is to erase the person. And so the hands that made the choice remain untouched, not because they did no wrong, but because their wrongness cannot find a subject. The universe begins to feel like a stage where suffering unfolds without accountability. Not because no one is watching, but because no one can be blamed. The pain is real. The cause is real. But the victim exists only because the harm happened. It is a loop that denies closure. And yet, there is more. The person born can still reflect, can still feel, can still ask, in a whisper not meant to be heard, "Was I wanted? Was I necessary? Was I worth the pain it took to bring me here?" And no answer arrives. Only the echo of intention, long vanished. The ones who made the choice move on. The world forgets, but the person remains. Ethics, when stretched this far, begins to show its limits. It was built to guide action between existing beings. It was not designed to weigh the morality of creation itself. And so the compass spins. Philosophers argue. Thinkers retreat. And the people who live with the consequences continue, caught in a question that can never be settled. Perhaps the answer is not whether it was right or wrong to bring someone into the world. Perhaps the answer lies in what is done once they are here. Whether they are heard. Whether they are loved. Whether their pain is acknowledged, not dismissed by the paradox of their existence. And perhaps the deepest compassion lies in holding the paradox gently, not rushing to resolve it, not justifying suffering by pointing to the breath that endures it, but saying softly, "This shouldn't have happened, and yet here you are." And that here still matters. The absurd. There is a question that does not leave. It follows from childhood into old age. It waits in the quiet hours, beneath celebration and sorrow. It is not loud. It does not accuse. It simply asks, what is the meaning of this? The mind wants purpose. The heart wants reason. The soul wants to believe that life, in all its struggle and beauty, leads somewhere. That pain is not random. That love is not fleeting. That choices add up to something beyond the moment. And so meaning is sought, in religion, in science, in history, in family, in art, each one offering a thread, a pattern, a narrative. But the stars do not respond. The universe, vast and ancient, says nothing. It spins. It expands. It burns and collapses. It creates life and destroys it without ceremony. The galaxies do not applaud heroism. The comets do not mourn loss, and beneath the beauty of the cosmos is an indifference so complete that it feels like silence wearing a crown. This is the absurd, not the ridiculous, not the comedic, but the chasm between desire and reality, the longing for order in a universe that offers none, the hunger for answers from a cosmos that does not speak. It is the scream that rises from the depths of thought and finds only echo. The absurd is not despair. It is not darkness. It is a recognition, a moment of seeing the truth and feeling its weight. Life wants meaning. The world offers none. That collision does not destroy. It awakens. Some turn to faith, to stories that promise design. Others turn to reason, to systems that explain, if not why, then how. But neither can close the gap entirely. Because meaning is not in the stars. It is in the longing for the stars to matter. and so the absurd must be faced. Some recoil. They choose comfort over clarity. Others rage. They demand meaning from gods, from laws, from fate. But the absurd cannot be argued with. It does not resist. It does not attack. It only is. A stillness in the face of the storm inside. Albert Camus named it. The absurd man is not the one who denies life's emptiness, nor the one who submits to despair. The absurd man sees the silence and continues. He walks the road, knowing it ends nowhere. He creates, knowing it will vanish. He laughs, knowing the joke has no punchline. This is not nihilism. It is defiance, not denial. A refusal to collapse under the weight of unanswered questions. A decision to live fully, even if the fullness leads only back to the void. The absurd does not take meaning from life. It gives life back its rawness. Every moment becomes urgent. Every touch becomes sacred, not because it leads somewhere, but because it does not. The light matters more when it shines for no reason. And yet, the absurd is a companion, not a teacher. It does not offer wisdom, only presence. It sits beside the seeker, quiet, watching. It nods when the question is asked again. It waits when the silence returns. It understands when the mind breaks into wonder and finds no boundary. The heart may never stop asking. The mind may never stop seeking. But the absurd does not mind. It honors the effort. It honors the struggle. It honors the breath that continues despite the silence. And in that breath, meaning is born, not given, but made. Not discovered, but lived. The hungry machine. Civilization is not a still thing. It breathes. It moves. It grows. And to grow, it feeds. Not on ideals or intentions, but on matter. On forests turned to furniture. On mountains ground into dust. On rivers bent into shape. On species turned into profit. The machine of progress wears a human face, but its appetite is not human. It is relentless, expanding, inhaling. Every light in every window is powered by something that was once wild. Every street carved through what once was wilderness. Every plastic object, every skyscraper, every soft blue glow of a screen, made from something that used to be alive or untouched. Civilization is comfort built on extraction, and prosperity, no matter how polished, is often built on extinction. This is not hidden, but it is not seen, because the machine is quiet. Its teeth do not make noise. Its workings are spread across continents, disguised as trade, as policy, as invention. It builds schools while burning forests. It opens clinics while poisoning oceans. It offers new clothes while digging into the bones of the earth. It speaks in languages of progress, growth, development. But the core remains the same: devour to survive. Every generation inherits the machine and is told it is a gift, the power to live longer, to move faster, to know more. And so the machine becomes sacred. It is improved, upgraded, optimized. But its hunger is never questioned. Because to question the machine is to question the shape of modern life itself. The machine grows, but only by consuming the world that birthed it. And so the contradiction deepens. The very systems built to protect life depend on systems that destroy it. The technology that saves lives depends on mining that poisons water. The medicine that heals is made in factories that darken skies. Even the food grown to nourish often relies on chemicals that sterilize the soil. There is no clean escape. Even those who resist, the ones who grow gardens, who speak gently to the earth, who reduce, recycle, refuse, still live within the walls. The machine has no outside. It is global. It is embedded. It is the architecture of life as it has been shaped for centuries. Some say the machine can be changed, made cleaner, more ethical, a gentler machine. But hunger is hunger, and every new technology, every new policy still requires energy, still requires matter, still reaches deeper into what remains of the natural world. Because the machine does not make from nothing. It only transforms. And what is transformed cannot be returned. A rainforest cleared for soy will not regrow in the shape it knew. A species lost to industry will not return when the demand changes. The time taken from future generations cannot be repaid with apology. The loss is permanent. And the hunger, undiminished. This is not condemnation. It is witnessing. The recognition that comfort has a cost, that convenience has a footprint, that civilization, for all its miracles, walks on bones. To live within the machine is not a choice for most. It is the only option. But even within it, awareness matters. The machine prefers to be unseen, to be invisible. And to see it clearly is a kind of resistance, not to destroy it, but to remember what it costs. And perhaps one day, to find a way to feed it less. The inversion of justice. Justice is an idea shaped in light, a promise that wrongs will be righted, that the innocent will be protected, that truth will matter. It is carved into buildings, written into books, sung in anthems. It wears robes. It holds scales. It speaks of fairness, balance, reason. But the reality often walks backward. Power does not always serve justice. More often, justice is made to serve power. The guilty escape, not by accident, but by design. Their wealth builds walls. Their status writes exceptions. Their alliances protect them from consequence. They bend the law not because they defy it, but because they own it. The innocent suffer, not randomly, but predictably. They suffer because they are poor, because they are voiceless, because their truths are inconvenient. Their pain is overwritten. Their stories are doubted. Their names are forgotten. And still, the theater continues. Justice becomes performance. A courtroom becomes a stage. The outcome is not determined by truth, but by who can afford better actors. The jury becomes audience. The verdict becomes script. And behind the curtain, deals are made, promises traded, futures decided not by evidence, but by proximity to power. Morality, in this system, becomes plastic. It bends to fit the moment. What is praised in one context is punished in another. The same action, committed by different hands, receives different judgment. A protest is righteous when led by the powerful. It is criminal when led by the desperate. And so, justice inverts. The sword no longer defends the weak. It defends the structure. The scales are not balanced. They are calibrated, adjusted to keep the illusion, to maintain the belief that something sacred still guides the hand. But truth no longer lives in the courtroom. It lives in the streets, in the whispers, in the restless sleep of those who know that justice is not coming, that the process is the punishment, that silence is the only safety. The inversion is complete when justice becomes punishment for asking for justice. When the protester is jailed and the exploiter celebrated. When truth becomes dangerous and denial becomes law. When even the word justice is spoken with irony. And yet, the myth endures. Because to lose faith in justice is to lose faith in order itself. People cling to the idea, even as the evidence rots. They believe in the promise, even as they are excluded from its protection. They continue to speak its name, hoping it might still answer. And sometimes it does. In flashes. In rare, hard-won moments, the mask slips. A truth prevails. A victim is heard. A system yields. But these are exceptions. And exceptions do not define the rule. They only prove how rare true justice has become. To live in such a world is to walk carefully. To know that righteousness is not enough. That innocence is not a shield. That justice, as it exists, may not be the justice the heart believes in. But still, The belief matters. Because belief, even betrayed, can become action. And action, even in a broken system, can move something real. Not quickly, not easily, but enough. Enough to remember what justice was meant to be, and to demand it again, not as theater, but as truth.